Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. There are moments in life when everything seems normal. The sun rises, coffee brews, children laugh in the backyard. Neighbors wave from their driveways. Christmas lights blink in rhythm with the season. But beneath these ordinary surfaces, something darker can grow, something most people never see until it's far too late. Violence doesn't always announce itself with warning signs painted in neon. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it sits across from you at the dinner table. Sometimes it's the person you've trusted for years, the one who knows your routines, your vulnerabilities, your fears. This is a collection of 5 stories that share a common thread. They span different years, different cities, different circumstances, but each one reveals how betrayal can fester in the most unexpected places, how obsession can wear the mask of love, how rage can simmer quietly behind closed doors until it explodes into something irreversible. These are not stories designed to sensationalize tragedy. They are accounts of real people whose lives were upended by violence that came from within their own circles. Some found justice quickly, others waited years, and in each case, the question remains the same. Could it have been prevented? The first story begins in Northern California, in a quiet suburb called Ashford Hills. The year is 2009, and Christmas Eve is just hours away. Families are gathering. Presents are wrapped. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon fills the air. But in one home, something catastrophic is about to unfold. The man responsible is someone who, on paper, seems like the last person anyone would suspect. Educated, articulate, successful in his career. Yet beneath that polished exterior lies a mind consumed by resentment, humiliation, and a terrifying need for control. Daniel Crossley was born in 1971 in a small town outside of Sacramento. His childhood was unremarkable in most ways. Middle-class family. 2 parents who worked steady jobs. A younger sister he rarely spoke about in later years. Teachers remembered him as exceptionally bright. The kind of student who absorbed information quickly and spoke with a confidence that sometimes bordered on arrogance. He excelled in mathematics and science, earning a full scholarship to a prestigious university where he studied aerospace engineering. By his mid-20s, Daniel had secured a position at a defense contractor, working on software systems for satellite communications. Colleagues described him as competent but difficult. He didn't take criticism well. He argued with supervisors. He seemed to believe that his intelligence entitled him to deference, and when that deference wasn't given, he withdrew into cold silence. Daniel's first serious relationship began in 1996. Her name was Jessica Tran, a graphic designer he met at a technology conference. They moved in together within 6 months. Jessica later told investigators that the early days felt like a whirlwind. Daniel was charming, attentive, generous with gifts. But soon, cracks appeared. He controlled their finances, insisting that he manage everything because he understood money better. He criticized her career choices, subtly suggesting that her work wasn't as important as his. When Jessica became pregnant in 1998, Daniel's behavior shifted again. He became distant, resentful. He complained about the cost of raising a child. He made comments about how the pregnancy had ruined Jessica's body. When their son was born, Daniel was absent more than he was present. He worked long hours, claiming the job demanded it. But Jessica noticed he seemed to find time for other things, nights out with coworkers, weekend trips he took alone. By 2000, Jessica had reached her breaking point. She confronted Daniel about his emotional withdrawal, his refusal to engage with their son, his constant criticism. The argument escalated quickly. Daniel didn't yell. He didn't throw things. Instead, he looked at her with what she later described as complete indifference and said, "If you're this unhappy, then leave." Jessica packed her things that night. She took their son and moved in with her parents. Daniel didn't fight for custody. He didn't ask to see the child. He simply vanished from their lives, leaving behind only the legal obligation of child support, which he paid irregularly and always with resentment. For the next several years, Daniel moved from job to job. His resume was impressive, but his employment history told a different story. He was terminated from one position after colleagues reported his hostile behavior during team meetings. He left another voluntarily after a formal complaint was filed about inappropriate comments he made to a female intern. By 2005, Daniel had relocated to Ashford Hills, a suburb north of San Francisco, where he found work at a smaller tech firm. The pay was less than what he'd earned before, and the work was less prestigious, but it was stable. He rented a modest apartment and seemed, for a while, to settle into a quieter existence. That same year, Daniel met Marina Delgado at a community event. Marina was a teacher, warm and optimistic, recently divorced with 2 daughters from her previous marriage. She found Daniel intriguing. He spoke about philosophy, about technology, about the future with a kind of intensity that made him seem passionate and thoughtful. Daniel, for his part, saw in Marina something he could rebuild his image around. A respectable partner, a ready-made family, a chance to appear normal again. They married in 2006, a small ceremony attended by Marina's family and a handful of Daniel's co-workers. Marina's daughters, ages 8 and 10, were cautious around their new stepfather, but Marina reassured them. She believed Daniel was simply reserved, that he needed time to adjust. What Marina didn't know was that Daniel had lied about almost everything. He told her he'd been married once before, but that it had ended amicably. He never mentioned his son. He claimed his previous job losses were due to company downsizing, not his own behavior. He exaggerated his current salary, leading Marina to believe they were more financially secure than they actually were. For a while, the deception held. They bought a small house together. They hosted dinners. They attended school events for the girls. But beneath the surface, Daniel was struggling. His job performance was declining. His supervisor had started documenting errors, missed deadlines, inappropriate outbursts during meetings. Daniel knew he was on thin ice, and the knowledge made him volatile. At home, Marina began noticing changes. Daniel was irritable, snapping at her over minor things. He criticized the way she disciplined her daughters, insisting his methods were superior despite having no real relationship with them. He started making unilateral financial decisions, moving money between accounts without telling her. When Marina questioned him, he accused her of being controlling, of not trusting him. The arguments became more frequent. Daniel's voice would rise, then drop into something colder, more calculated. He would list her perceived failures, her lack of ambition, her dependence on him. Marina felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller in her own home. In early 2009, Daniel was terminated from his job. The official reason was performance-related, but there had been an incident the week before. A confrontation with a younger colleague who had corrected Daniel's work in front of others. Daniel had stood, face flushed, and said something that made everyone in the room go silent. The exact words were never confirmed, but they were threatening enough that security was called. Daniel was escorted out that afternoon. He drove home in a state of barely controlled rage, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He didn't tell Marina immediately. Instead, he left the house each morning as if going to work, spending his days at coffee shops and libraries, searching for new positions that never materialized. When Marina eventually discovered the truth, it was through a phone call from their bank. A mortgage payment had been missed. Marina confronted Daniel that evening, and the fight that followed was unlike anything before. Daniel didn't just argue. He unraveled. He shouted that nothing he did was ever good enough, that everyone conspired against him, that he was surrounded by mediocrity and ingratitude. Marina stood her ground. She told him she wanted a separation, that she needed space to think. Daniel's face went blank. He walked out of the room without another word. Over the following months, Daniel became a ghost in his own home. He slept in the guest room. He barely spoke to Marina or her daughters. He spent hours online, researching subjects Marina couldn't identify when she glanced at his screen. She assumed he was job hunting, but the truth was far darker. Daniel was planning something. The divorce papers arrived in September 2009. Marina had consulted with an attorney and decided she couldn't continue living in the toxic environment their marriage had become. She wanted the house, primary custody considerations for her daughters, even though they weren't Daniel's biological children, and a clean separation of assets. Daniel received the papers at the house one afternoon while Marina was at work. He sat at the kitchen table, reading through each page with methodical precision. His hands didn't shake. His breathing remained steady. But something inside him shifted irrevocably in that moment. To Daniel, The divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was another in a long series of rejections, humiliations, failures that he believed were never his fault. Jessica had left him. Employers had dismissed him. Colleagues had undermined him. And now Marina was abandoning him too, taking with her the last remnants of the life he'd constructed. In Daniel's mind, he'd given these people everything: his intelligence, his time, his presence, and they had repaid him with betrayal. The narrative he built for himself was one of victimhood, but beneath that narrative was something far more dangerous, a belief that he was entitled to punish those who had wronged him. Daniel hired an attorney, but showed little interest in negotiating. He attended mediation sessions with a blank expression, agreeing to terms that his own lawyer advised against. Marina found this unsettling. She'd expected him to fight, to argue, to make the process difficult. Instead, he seemed almost cooperative, which made her more nervous than his anger ever had. She mentioned her concerns to a friend, saying that Daniel's calmness felt wrong, like the quiet before a storm. Her friend suggested she was overthinking it, that maybe Daniel had simply accepted reality. Marina wanted to believe that. She desperately wanted to believe that this would end peacefully. But Daniel wasn't accepting anything. He was planning. In October, he purchased a handgun from a private seller, a transaction that required no background check under California law at the time for certain private sales. He paid cash. He gave a fake name. The seller, an older man cleaning out his late father's estate, didn't ask questions. Daniel drove home with the weapon concealed in a gym bag, his mind already moving through the logistics of what he intended to do. He researched ammunition types, reading forum discussions about stopping power and reliability. He watched videos about shooting stances and accuracy. He practiced loading and unloading the weapon in his locked bedroom, the metallic clicks becoming a familiar rhythm. He also began watching Marina's routines. He knew her schedule, where she went, when she'd be home, when her daughters would be with her, and when they'd be at their father's house. He drove past her workplace during lunch hours, noting which car she parked near, which entrance she used. He scrolled through her social media, taking screenshots of posts about upcoming plans. Marina had mentioned on Facebook that her extended family would be gathering for Christmas Eve at her mother's house, a tradition that had continued every year since Marina was a child. She posted about how much the girls loved seeing their cousins, how special the holiday always felt. Daniel read these posts with cold focus, making mental notes. In November, Daniel moved out of the house as required by the separation agreement. He rented a small apartment across town, a place with thin walls and stained carpets that smelled of cigarette smoke from previous tenants. He furnished it minimally: a mattress on the floor, a folding table, a single chair. He didn't plan to be there long. The apartment was just a staging ground, a place to wait until the right moment arrived. He continued to send Marina occasional text messages, most of them brief and neutral. "Hope you're doing well. Let me know if you need anything from the house." The messages seemed almost conciliatory, and Marina, exhausted from months of conflict, took them at face value. She responded politely, keeping her answers short. She wanted to believe that Daniel was moving on, that the worst was behind them. December arrived with unseasonably cold weather for Northern California. Ashford Hills saw frost in the mornings, and residents bundled into scarves and heavy coats, their breath visible in the air. Marina threw herself into preparing for Christmas, determined to make it special for her daughters despite the upheaval of the divorce. She bought gifts, decorated the house, baked cookies late into the night. Her mother, a woman named Rosa Delgado, had invited the entire extended family to her home for Christmas Eve dinner, just as she did every year. There would be nearly 20 people in attendance: aunts, uncles, cousins, children ranging from toddlers to teenagers. Rosa's house was large enough to accommodate everyone, with a spacious living room that opened into a dining area and a backyard where the kids could play if the weather permitted. Marina's daughters were excited. They'd been through a difficult year, watching their mother's marriage crumble, adjusting to Daniel's absence, but the promise of Christmas with their cousins lifted their spirits. The older daughter, Isabel, asked Marina if Daniel would be there. Marina hesitated before answering. "No, honey, Daniel won't be joining us. It's just going to be our family." Isabel nodded, looking relieved. Neither of the girls had bonded with Daniel, and his departure from their lives had been met with quiet acceptance rather than grief. Daniel knew about the gathering. He'd seen Marina's Facebook posts, the photos she'd shared of previous Christmas Eves at her mother's house. He knew the address. He'd driven past it several times in early December, studying the layout, the street parking, the proximity of neighboring homes. He noted that Rose's house sat on a corner lot with a large oak tree in the front yard. The driveway could fit 3 cars. The front door was wooden, substantial but not reinforced. There were windows facing the street, curtains usually drawn after dark. Daniel absorbed these details like a student preparing for an exam, methodical and thorough. On December 23rd, Daniel went to a sporting goods store and purchased additional ammunition, along with a large black duffel bag. The clerk who rang him up barely looked at him. Just another customer in the pre-holiday rush. Daniel returned to his apartment and spent the evening preparing. He loaded the gun's magazine, his movements practiced and efficient. He packed the duffel bag with the weapon, extra ammunition, a change of clothes, and a small container of gasoline he'd siphoned from his car. He also included a mask, a simple black ski mask he'd bought online weeks earlier. He sat on the edge of his mattress, staring at the packed bag, his mind eerily calm. He'd made his decision. There was no hesitation, no last-minute doubt. In Daniel's fractured logic, what he was about to do was justified. These people had taken everything from him. Now he would take everything from them. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Marina woke early, helping her daughters wrap the last of their gifts for their cousins. The girls were giddy with anticipation, barely able to sit still during breakfast. Marina felt a flutter of happiness watching them, a reminder that life could still hold moments of simple joy despite everything that had happened. She loaded the presents into her car along with 2 pies she'd baked the night before, pecan and apple, her mother's favorites. They arrived at Rose's house around 3 in the afternoon, greeted by the warm chaos of family already gathering. Children ran through the hallways, shrieking with laughter. The smell of roasting ham filled the air, mingling with cinnamon and pine from the Christmas tree in the living room. Rosa hugged Marina tightly, whispering that she was proud of her, that she was strong, that everything would be okay. Marina felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them away, not wanting to dampen the mood. She joined her aunts in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, falling into the familiar rhythms of holiday preparation. Her daughters disappeared into the backyard with their cousins, their voices carrying through the open, sliding glass door. For a few hours, Marina allowed herself to forget about Daniel, about the divorce, about the uncertainty of what came next. She was surrounded by people who loved her, and that felt like enough. Daniel, meanwhile, was preparing for his own version of the evening. He showered and dressed in dark clothing, jeans, and a black jacket. He strapped the loaded gun to his waist, concealing it beneath the jacket. He placed the duffel bag in the trunk of his car, then sat behind the wheel, staring at nothing. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot of his apartment complex. He started the engine and began the drive toward Rose's house, his expression blank, his thoughts organized into a sequence of actions he would execute with precision. He arrived at the neighborhood just after 6. The street was quiet, most families already inside their own homes for holiday celebrations. Christmas lights blinked from porches and windows, cheerful and oblivious. Daniel parked 2 blocks away from Rose's house, in a spot beneath a broken streetlight where his car would be harder to notice. He retrieved the duffel bag from the trunk and slung it over his shoulder, then walked toward the house with steady, unhurried steps. His breath misted in the cold air. His heart rate remained calm. He'd rehearsed this in his mind so many times that it no longer felt hypothetical. It felt inevitable. As he approached the house, he could hear voices and music drifting from inside. Through the windows, he saw shapes moving, people laughing, children darting between adults. He circled around to the side of the house where the driveway met the backyard. The sliding glass door was partially open, left that way to let in fresh air and allow the kids to move freely between inside and outside. Daniel paused there, watching. He saw Marina in the kitchen, her back to him, talking with another woman. He saw her daughters playing a board game with their cousins in the living room. He saw Rosa setting the dining table, adjusting silverware and napkins with careful attention. Daniel pulled the ski mask over his face. He reached into the duffel bag and withdrew the gun, feeling its weight settle into his palm. This was the point of no return, the moment when thought became action, when planning became reality. He took one breath, then stepped through the sliding glass door. The first person to notice him was a teenage cousin named Marcus, who'd been heading toward the kitchen for a soda. Marcus froze mid-step, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. A man in a ski mask, holding a gun, standing in the doorway like something out of a nightmare. For a split second, Marcus thought it might be a joke, some tasteless prank, but then he saw the way the man was holding the weapon, the deliberate purpose in his stance, and Marcus's body understood before his mind could catch up. He stumbled backward, knocking into a chair, and the sound drew everyone's attention. The room fell into a suspended moment of confusion. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Rosa dropped the napkins she'd been holding, her hand flying to her mouth. Marina turned from the kitchen, her expression shifting from curiosity to horror in the span of a heartbeat. She recognized something in the man's build, the way he carried himself, and even through the mask she knew. "Daniel," she whispered, but the word came out strangled, barely audible. Daniel raised the gun, and the room exploded into chaos. Someone screamed. Children began crying. Adults moved instinctively, some diving toward the kids to shield them, others scrambling for cover behind furniture. Daniel fired the first shot into the ceiling, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that seemed to stop time. Plaster dust rained down. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and chemical. "Nobody move," Daniel said, his voice eerily calm, muffled slightly by the mask. "Nobody leaves." Marina's sister, a woman named Teresa, was closest to the sliding door. She made a desperate break for it, grabbing her young son's hand and trying to pull him outside. Daniel swung the gun toward her and fired. The bullet struck Teresa in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the wall. Her son screamed, a high-pitched wail of terror that seemed to pierce through everything else. Teresa clutched her shoulder, blood seeping between her fingers, her face contorted in pain and disbelief. Her husband lunged toward her, and Daniel fired again, this time hitting the man in the leg. He went down hard, crying out. The room descended into pandemonium. People were screaming, crying, trying to huddle together or crawl toward exits. Daniel moved methodically through the space, his gun tracking from person to person. He seemed to be looking for someone specific, his gaze sweeping across faces. Marina realized with sick certainty that he was looking for her. She'd pressed herself against the kitchen counter, her mind racing through impossible calculations. She could try to run, but where? She could try to reason with him, but what words could possibly reach someone who'd already decided to do this? Rosa, trembling but somehow finding her voice, spoke up. "Daniel, please. There are children here. Whatever you're angry about, we can talk. Just put the gun down." Daniel turned toward her, and for a moment Marina thought her mother might actually get through to him. But then Daniel laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Talk? Like you all talked about me behind my back? Like you all decided I wasn't good enough for your precious Marina?" Rosa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. We just wanted her to be happy. Please, Daniel, please don't do this." Daniel ignored her and focused on Marina. "There you are," he said, moving toward the kitchen. Marina's daughters, seeing him approach their mother, screamed for her. Isabel tried to run to Marina, but an uncle grabbed her, holding her back. Daniel's attention flickered toward the girls for just a moment, and Marina saw her opportunity. There was a knife block on the counter beside her. Her hand shot out, grabbing the largest knife, and she held it up with shaking hands. "Stay away from them," she said, her voice cracking. "Stay away from my daughters." Daniel stopped, regarding the knife with something like amusement. "You think that's going to stop me?" He raised the gun, pointing it directly at Marina's chest. She could see his finger on the trigger, could see the dark barrel aimed at her heart. Time seemed to slow. She heard her daughters screaming her name. She heard her mother begging. She heard the ragged breathing of her wounded sister and brother-in-law. And she heard her own heartbeat, thunderous in her ears, each beat potentially her last. The shot never came. Instead, there was a crash from the front of the house. The front door burst open, kicked in by a neighbor who'd heard the gunshots and called 911. The neighbor, a retired Marine named Tom Kowalski, had grabbed his own weapon and come running. He appeared in the doorway to the living room, his gun raised, shouting commands. "Drop it! Drop the weapon now!" Daniel spun toward this new threat, his gun swinging away from Marina. For a fraction of a second, everyone held their breath. Daniel made his choice. He fired at Tom, the bullet going wide and shattering a window behind him. Tom returned fire, his training kicking in, 3 controlled shots that struck Daniel in the chest and abdomen. Daniel staggered backward, his gun falling from his hand and clattering across the floor. He hit the wall and slid down it, leaving a smear of blood on the cream-colored paint. His breathing was labored, wet-sounding, his hands clutching at the wounds that were pouring blood onto his dark clothing. The room was silent except for the crying of children and the moans of the wounded. Tom kept his gun trained on Daniel, moving carefully to kick Daniel's weapon away, sending it sliding across the room. Marina collapsed against the counter, the knife falling from her hands as her legs gave out. She sank to the floor, her whole body shaking, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Her daughters broke free from their uncle and ran to her, throwing their arms around her, all 3 of them sobbing. Rosa rushed to Teresa, pressing dish towels against her daughter's bleeding shoulder, whispering prayers in Spanish. Other family members attended to Teresa's husband, trying to slow the bleeding from his leg wound. Someone had the presence of mind to call 911 again, shouting into the phone that they needed ambulances, multiple ambulances, that people had been shot. In the distance, sirens were already wailing, growing louder, neighbors having called in reports of gunfire. Daniel lay against the wall, his breathing growing shallower. The ski mask had been knocked askew, revealing part of his face. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but they seemed unfocused, distant. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading. Tom kept his position, gun still aimed, not taking any chances. He called out to Daniel, "Stay down. Help is coming. Just stay down." But Daniel didn't respond. His chest rose and fell in irregular intervals, each breath more labored than the last. The first police officers arrived within minutes, flooding through the broken front door with weapons drawn, shouting commands. They secured the scene, handcuffing Daniel even in his weakened state, checking on the wounded, separating witnesses for statements. Paramedics rushed in behind them, their voices calm and professional as they triaged the injured. Teresa and her husband were loaded onto stretchers first, their wounds serious but survivable. The paramedics worked on Daniel next, but their urgency was less pronounced. They could see he was dying, the chest wounds too severe, too much blood loss. They did what they could, starting IVs, applying pressure, but their eyes told the story. Daniel was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the nearest trauma center. He died 17 minutes later, never regaining consciousness, never speaking another word. The 3 rounds Tom had fired had torn through vital organs, and there was simply too much damage. The doctors pronounced him dead at 7:42 on Christmas Eve, surrounded by strangers in a sterile emergency room, alone in the most complete sense of the word. Back at Rosa's house, the scene was controlled chaos. Police photographers documented everything: the bullet holes in the walls, the blood on the floors, the overturned furniture and scattered presents. Detectives interviewed family members one by one, taking statements while social workers attended to the traumatized children. Marina sat wrapped in a blanket that a paramedic had given her, her daughters pressed against her sides, none of them able to stop shaking. An officer asked her gentle questions about her relationship with Daniel, about the divorce, about whether she'd seen any warning signs. Marina answered in a monotone, her voice hollow. "I knew he was angry," she said. "I knew he blamed me. But I never imagined he would do something like this." The detective nodded sympathetically, making notes. "Did he ever threaten you directly? Make any statements about hurting you or your family?" Marina thought back through the months of arguments, the cold silences, the bitter emails exchanged through their lawyers. "He said once that I would regret leaving him," she said slowly. "But I thought he meant financially, that he'd make the divorce difficult. I didn't think he meant." She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Tom Kowalski was being interviewed separately, his own hands still shaking from adrenaline. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq, seen combat, but this had been different. This was his quiet suburban neighborhood, a holiday gathering, children present. He'd acted on instinct, muscle memory from training that had never fully left him. "I heard the shots," he told the detective. "I grabbed my weapon and I went to help. I identified myself, gave him a chance to surrender. He fired at me, so I fired back. That's all there is to it. The detective assured him that his actions likely saved lives, that he'd be cleared of any wrongdoing. But Tom didn't seem to hear the words. He kept seeing Daniel's gun swinging toward him, kept feeling the recoil of his own weapon, kept wondering if there was something else he could have done. The wounded were stable at the hospital. Teresa would need surgery to repair damage to her shoulder, but she'd recover. Her husband's leg wound had miraculously missed major arteries, and doctors expected a full recovery with physical therapy. The psychological wounds, however, would take much longer to heal. The children who'd witnessed the attack would need counseling, years of it probably. The adults who'd been present would relive those moments in nightmares and flashbacks. The family's sense of safety, their ability to gather without fear, had been shattered in a way that felt irreparable. In the days following the attack, investigators worked to piece together Daniel's final weeks. They obtained search warrants for his apartment and found a scene that painted a disturbing picture of his mental state. The walls were covered with printouts of Marina's Facebook posts, some with angry notes scrawled in the margins. There were diagrams of Rose's house, sketches showing entry points and lines of sight. His computer search history revealed months of research into firearms, ammunition ballistics, and disturbingly, tactics used in mass shootings. He'd watched videos of surveillance footage from other attacks, seemingly studying them for technique. He'd visited forums where angry men vented about divorce, about women who'd wronged them, about a world they felt had conspired against them. Detectives found a notebook filled with Daniel's handwriting, pages and pages of rambling grievances. He wrote about Jessica, his first partner, calling her a traitor who'd stolen his son and poisoned the child against him. He wrote about former employers, accusing them of discrimination and jealousy. He wrote about Marina's family, describing them as parasites who'd never respected him, who'd looked down on him from the beginning. The writing grew increasingly erratic toward the end, the handwriting itself deteriorating into something barely legible. On the final page, dated December 23rd, he'd written a single sentence. They'll finally understand what they've done. There was no formal suicide note, no explanation that would satisfy the need for understanding. Daniel had planned to die that night. That much was clear. Whether he'd intended to be killed by police or to take his own life after the attack remained uncertain, but he'd packed the container of gasoline in his duffel bag, suggesting he might have planned to set fire to the house with everyone inside. The investigators who reviewed the evidence felt sick thinking about what could have happened if Tom Kowalski hadn't intervened when he did. The media descended on Ashford Hills with predictable intensity. News vans lined the streets around Rose's house. Reporters interviewed neighbors who described Daniel as quiet, strange, a man who kept to himself. They dug into his employment history, interviewing former colleagues who spoke carefully about his difficulties working with others, his tendency to perceive slights where none existed. They found Jessica and her son, now a young man of 11, living quietly in another state. Jessica declined most interview requests, but she did release a brief statement through an attorney. My heart breaks for the Delgado family. Daniel was troubled in ways I couldn't help him with years ago. I'm grateful that more people weren't killed, and I hope the survivors can find peace. Marina and her family refused all media requests. They were trying to process their trauma privately, surrounded by therapists and victim advocates who worked with them daily. Marina blamed herself relentlessly, even though everyone told her she couldn't have known, couldn't have predicted this. I should have seen it, she said to her therapist during one session, her eyes red from crying. I lived with him. I knew he was angry. Why didn't I see that he was capable of this? The therapist, a woman who'd worked with domestic violence survivors for 20 years, chose her words carefully. You saw a man who was angry and bitter, but anger doesn't always lead to violence. Most angry people don't commit murder. You're not responsible for his choices. But the guilt persisted. Marina couldn't shake the feeling that she'd brought this danger into her family's life, that her decision to marry Daniel, to bring him into their circle, had nearly destroyed everyone she loved. Her daughters had nightmares every night, waking up screaming. Isabel refused to sleep in her own room, terrified of being alone. The younger daughter stopped speaking for 3 days after the attack, communicating only through nods and head shakes. Child psychologists worked with them gently, using play therapy and art to help them process what they'd witnessed. Rose's house remained empty for weeks. No one could bear to go back inside. The blood had been professionally cleaned, the bullet holes repaired, but the space itself felt haunted. Rosa eventually decided to sell it, unable to imagine ever hosting another family gathering there. The new owners got it for well below market value, and even they had the interior completely renovated before moving in, tearing out walls and replacing floors, trying to erase the history that had soaked into the structure. The funerals came next, though there was only Daniel's to arrange, and no one from Marina's family attended. Daniel's parents, elderly and devastated, held a small private service. They'd had minimal contact with their son in recent years, bewildered by the person he'd become. His mother wept throughout the ceremony, whispering, "I don't understand," over and over. His father sat in stony silence, his face a mask of shame and grief. They buried Daniel in a plain coffin in an unremarkable cemetery, the headstone bearing only his name and dates, no epitaph, no words of love or remembrance. They moved out of state 6 months later, unable to bear the weight of their community's judgment and their own unanswered questions. Psychological experts who reviewed Daniel's case identified a pattern they'd seen before: narcissistic personality disorder complicated by what appeared to be mounting paranoia and possibly delusional thinking. Daniel had constructed an identity around being superior, more intelligent, more deserving than those around him. When reality repeatedly contradicted this self-image, when he was fired, divorced, rejected, his psyche couldn't integrate those failures. Instead, he externalized all blame, building a worldview where he was the victim of widespread conspiracy and betrayal. The violence was his attempt to reassert control, to punish those he held responsible, and to author a final chapter where he, not circumstances or other people, decided how the story ended. But understanding the psychology didn't ease the pain. It didn't help Marina sleep through the night or stop her daughters from flinching at sudden noises. It didn't restore Teresa's full range of motion in her shoulder or erase the permanent limp in her husband's gait. It didn't bring back the innocence of the children who'd hidden under tables while bullets flew overhead. The Delgado family was fundamentally changed, and no amount of therapy or time would return them to who they'd been before that Christmas Eve. A year later, on the anniversary of the attack, the family gathered again, but not at anyone's home. They met at a church, a neutral space that held no traumatic memories. They lit candles for each person who'd been in the house that night, a ritual of remembrance and survival. Marina stood before them and spoke, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Daniel took so much from us," she said. "He took our sense of safety. He took our ability to celebrate without fear. He almost took our lives. But he didn't win. We're still here. We're still a family. And we won't let his hatred define us." The words were true, but they were also aspirational. The reality was messier, harder. Some family relationships had frayed under the stress of shared trauma. Some members dealt with their pain through withdrawal, becoming distant and unavailable. Others clung too tightly, unable to let loved ones out of sight. The children who'd been present struggled in school, their concentration shattered, their trust in adult safety demolished. But they were surviving, and survival, in the aftermath of such violence, was itself a form of victory. Tom Kowalski, the neighbor who'd intervened, struggled with his own aftermath. He was hailed as a hero in the community, but he didn't feel heroic. He felt haunted by the necessity of what he'd done, by the fact that he'd had to kill someone on Christmas Eve, regardless of how justified it was. He attended therapy, processed his feelings with a counselor who specialized in traumatic stress, and eventually found some measure of peace. He became an advocate for responsible gun ownership and for intervention training, teaching others how to respond to active shooter situations. It was his way of making meaning from tragedy, of ensuring that his actions that night could serve a purpose beyond that single moment. The broader community of Ashford Hills grappled with questions about what they'd missed, whether there were warning signs that should have prompted action. Neighbors remembered Daniel as odd, but not threatening. Coworkers had found him difficult, but not dangerous. Even Marina, who'd lived with him, had feared his anger, but not his potential for mass violence. The uncomfortable truth was that Daniel had been skilled at concealing the full depth of his rage until the moment he chose to unleash it. There had been red flags: his history of job losses, his pattern of failed relationships, his inability to accept responsibility. But these things alone didn't predict murder. Millions of people struggle with anger and resentment without ever harming anyone. The challenge, the impossible challenge, was identifying which angry person would cross the line from thought to action. In the end, Daniel's case became a study in how violence incubates in isolation, how grievances can ferment into hatred when left unaddressed, how a sense of victimhood can justify the unjustifiable in a distorted mind. It became a reminder that the people we think we know may be hiding depths of pain and rage we never suspected. And it became a testament to the resilience of survivors who refused to let a single night of horror define the rest of their lives, even when that night left scars that would never fully heal. The story of what happened at Rosa Delgado's house on Christmas Eve 2009 spread beyond Ashford Hills, becoming one of those cautionary tales that people reference when discussing domestic violence, divorce-related homicides, and family annihilators. But for those who lived through it, it wasn't a cautionary tale or a case study. It was simply the worst night of their lives, a before and after dividing line that separated everything into two categories: the world as it was before Daniel walked through that sliding door, and the world as it became after. Marina eventually remarried, years later, to a gentle man who understood her triggers and her need for security. Her daughters grew up, carrying their trauma but not letting it destroy them. Teresa regained most of the function in her shoulder. The family learned to celebrate holidays again, though never on Christmas Eve and never all in one place. They scattered their gatherings across different times and locations, a practical accommodation to the anxiety that still lived in all of them. The second story moves forward in time and shifts to a different kind of horror. This one unfolds in the Midwest, in a city called Riverbend, and it centers on the disappearance of a child. The year is 2021, and the world is still navigating the uncertainties of a pandemic that has isolated families and strained communities. In this environment of heightened vigilance and paradoxical vulnerability, a 9-year-old girl named Layla Monroe vanishes from what should have been a safe environment, and the search for answers reveals how trust can be weaponized against the innocent. Layla was the kind of child people remember. Bright-eyed and curious, she asked endless questions about everything from why the sky changed colors at sunset to how birds knew which direction to fly. She loved reading, often carrying a book with her wherever she went, and she had a particular fondness for stories about animals and adventure. Her teachers described her as engaged and kind, the type of student who noticed when classmates seemed sad and would quietly offer to share her snacks or sit with them at lunch. She had her mother's warm smile and her father's stubborn determination, a combination that made her both endearing and occasionally frustrating to parent. Layla lived with her mother, Nicole Monroe, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Riverbend. Nicole worked as a dental hygienist, managing long hours and the stress of single parenthood with as much grace as she could muster. Layla's father, Marcus, lived across town with his new wife. The divorce had been difficult but not acrimonious, and both parents made genuine efforts to co-parent effectively. Layla spent weekends with her father, and the transitions between households had become routine enough that they no longer caused the tears and protests they had in the early months after the separation. Nicole's social circle included other single mothers from Layla's school, women who supported each other through the challenges of raising children alone. Among them was a woman named Daphne Cole, whose son attended the same school as Layla. Daphne and Nicole had bonded over coffee at school pickup, their friendship developing through shared complaints about homework policies and school fundraisers. Daphne lived with her brother, Terrence, a man in his late 30s who worked sporadically in construction and had a history that Nicole knew only in vague terms. Daphne had mentioned once that Terrence had gotten into some trouble years ago, but had turned his life around. Nicole hadn't pressed for details, respecting the privacy everyone deserved about their family's difficulties. On the evening of March 12, 2021, Nicole faced a problem. She'd been called in for an emergency shift at the dental office, a patient with a severe abscess that needed immediate attention. Marcus was out of town for work and unavailable to take Layla. Nicole's own mother lived 4 hours away. She scrolled through her mental list of babysitters, but it was Friday night, and most were already committed. In desperation, she called Daphne, explaining the situation and asking if Layla could possibly stay at her apartment for a few hours until Nicole got home from work. Daphne readily agreed. "Of course," she said warmly. "The kids can have a sleepover. Layla's always welcome here. Nicole felt a wave of relief and gratitude. She packed an overnight bag for Layla, including her favorite pajamas and the book she was currently reading, a fantasy novel about a girl who could talk to wolves. "You'll be good for Miss Daphne, right?" Nicole asked, kneeling down to Layla's eye level. Layla nodded enthusiastically. She liked Daphne's son and was excited about the unexpected sleepover. "We're going to watch movies and have popcorn," Layla said, already imagining the evening ahead. Nicole hugged her daughter tightly, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "I love you, baby. I'll pick you up first thing in the morning." She dropped Layla off at Daphne's apartment just after 6 o'clock, waving as Layla disappeared inside, already chattering away with Daphne's son. Nicole worked her shift, treating the patient and cleaning up afterward. She texted Daphne around 8:30 to check in, and Daphne responded promptly. "All good here. Kids are watching Frozen. Again. Send help. LOL." Nicole smiled at the message, reassured. She finished at the office around 9 and drove home, exhausted but grateful the emergency had been handled. She planned to shower and sleep, then pick up Layla around 9 the next morning. She fell asleep quickly, her phone on the nightstand, unaware that everything was about to fall apart. What Nicole didn't know was that Terrence Cole had been home that evening. Daphne had mentioned her brother might stop by, but she'd framed it casually, and Nicole hadn't thought much of it. Terrence had a history that should have raised alarms, but that information lived in police databases and court records, not in the casual conversations between school parents. He'd been convicted of child molestation in 2009, serving 6 years in prison before his release in 2015. He was a registered sex offender, required to stay away from minors, but enforcement of such restrictions was inconsistent at best, and Terrence lived with his sister in an apartment where children frequently visited. That night, according to later testimony from Daphne's son, Terrence had come home around 7. The children had been in the living room watching television while Daphne prepared snacks in the kitchen. Terrence had joined them, sitting on the couch, making small talk about the movie. Daphne's son said his uncle seemed normal, not angry or strange, just quiet like he usually was. At some point, Terrence had asked Layla if she wanted to see something cool in his room, a collection of interesting rocks he'd gathered from various construction sites. Layla, trusting and curious by nature, had followed him down the hallway. What happened in that room would never be fully known. Terrence never gave a complete account, and Layla never came home to tell her story. What investigators would later piece together from evidence suggested that Terrence had assaulted Layla, and when she tried to scream or fight back, he'd panicked. He'd covered her mouth to silence her, pressing too hard or too long, and somewhere in those desperate moments, Layla had stopped breathing. Whether he'd intended to kill her or whether her death was the result of his panic to keep her quiet became a point of legal debate, but the end result was the same. Layla Monroe died in that room, in a place her mother had trusted, while a Disney movie played in the next room and her friend ate popcorn unaware. Terrence had carried Layla's small body to his car, wrapped in a blanket from his bed. He'd told Daphne he was going out for cigarettes, a common enough occurrence that she didn't question it. He drove into the rural areas outside Riverbend, areas he knew from construction jobs, places where development hadn't yet reached and the land stretched empty under the dark sky. He found a spot near an abandoned farm, hidden by overgrown vegetation and far from any roads or houses. He buried Layla in a shallow grave, using a shovel he kept in his trunk for work. Then he drove home, his hands shaking, his mind racing through scenarios and lies. When he returned to the apartment, Daphne asked where Layla was. Terrence, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, said that Layla had gotten a call from her mother asking him to drop her off at home because Nicole had finished work early. He said he'd driven Layla back to her apartment and watched her go inside safely. It was a lie that should have fallen apart immediately, but in the confusion and chaos of what came next, it gained just enough traction to complicate everything. Nicole woke Saturday morning and drove to Daphne's apartment as planned. When Daphne answered the door and said that Terrence had already taken Layla home the night before, Nicole felt her stomach drop. "What? When? I never called. I was going to pick her up this morning." Daphne's face went pale. "Terrence said you called around 9, asked him to bring her home." Nicole was already pulling out her phone, checking her call log, seeing no outgoing calls to Daphne or anyone else. "I didn't call. I never called. Where is she? Where's Layla? The two women stared at each other, understanding dawning in horrible synchronization. Daphne called for Terrence, her voice rising into panic. He emerged from his room, and Nicole immediately demanded answers. Where's my daughter? Daphne said you took her home, but I was home all night. She never came home. Where is she? Terrence maintained his story, insisting he'd driven Layla to her apartment building, watched her go inside. Maybe she went to a friend's place, he suggested, his voice carefully concerned. Maybe she got confused about where she was supposed to go. Nicole was already calling the police, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. When the dispatcher answered, Nicole could barely get the words out. My daughter is missing. She was supposed to be at a friend's house, but she's gone. I don't know where she is. The dispatcher asked for details, for descriptions, for timelines. Nicole provided everything through tears, her mind fragmenting into terrible possibilities. Officers were dispatched immediately, arriving at Daphne's apartment within 15 minutes. The initial questioning revealed the discrepancy in Terrence's story almost immediately. Nicole's phone records showed no calls to Daphne or Terrence. The apartment building's security footage, grainy but functional, showed no sign of Layla returning the previous night. Terrence's story began to unravel, but he clung to it stubbornly, suggesting maybe he'd dropped her at the wrong building. Maybe he'd been confused. The officers, experienced enough to recognize deception, focused their attention on him with increasing intensity. Within hours, Terrence Cole became the primary person of interest in Layla's disappearance. Officers ran his background and discovered his sex offender status, a revelation that sent Nicole into a spiral of anguish and rage. You let my daughter stay here with him? She screamed at Daphne, who was crying and shaking her head. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know she'd be around him. He was supposed to be out that night. I thought he was working. But the explanations felt hollow against the magnitude of what had happened. Nicole collapsed against the wall, her legs giving out, her mind unable to process the nightmare unfolding around her. Police obtained a warrant to search Terrence's room and vehicle. They found the blanket missing from his bed, a detail Daphne confirmed when asked about his bedding. They found dirt in the trunk of his car, fresh soil that didn't match the construction sites where he claimed to have been working. They found traces of blood on the carpet in his bedroom, small spots that had been hastily wiped but not thoroughly cleaned. The blood would later be confirmed as Layla's through DNA testing, but in those early hours, it was enough to justify taking Terrence into custody for questioning. At the police station, Terrence was read his rights and placed in an interrogation room. Detectives worked in shifts, approaching him from different angles, building rapport and then applying pressure. Terrence maintained his innocence for hours, sticking to his story about dropping Layla off at home. But as evidence mounted, as detectives confronted him with the inconsistencies and the physical proof, cracks began to show. He changed small details, claiming he might have been mistaken about the exact address, suggesting perhaps Layla had run away from him on the drive. The detectives pressed harder. Terrence, we know something happened. We have blood. We have forensics. Help us understand. Was it an accident? Did something go wrong? Terrence's attorney, a public defender assigned to his case, advised him to stop talking. Terrence followed that advice, going silent and refusing to answer any further questions. He was formally arrested and charged with kidnapping and suspicion of murder, though without a body. The murder charge would be difficult to prove. The legal machinery ground into motion, but for Nicole and her family, the waiting was excruciating. Layla was still out there somewhere, and every hour that passed diminished the hope of finding her alive. The community mobilized with remarkable speed. Within 24 hours of Layla's disappearance being reported, hundreds of volunteers gathered to search. They combed through parks, wooded areas, drainage ditches, abandoned buildings, anywhere a child might be hidden or discarded. Nicole walked with them, her eyes scanning every shadow, her voice hoarse from calling her daughter's name. Marcus flew back immediately, and despite their divorce, he and Nicole clung to each other in shared agony. Television stations ran Layla's picture continuously. Social media exploded with shares and speculation. Tips poured into the police hotline, each one investigated, most leading nowhere. Daphne Cole was destroyed by guilt and grief. She gave multiple interviews to police, cooperating fully, desperate to help find Layla. Her son, traumatized by the realization of what his uncle might have done, was placed in therapy and interviewed gently by specialists trained in talking to child witnesses. He confirmed that Layla had followed Terrence to his room, that he hadn't seen her again after that his uncle had left the apartment alone later that evening. The timeline fit with Terrence's opportunity to dispose of Layla's body, but it didn't reveal where she was. Investigators focused on Terrence's known locations, places he frequented, areas where he'd worked. They brought in cadaver dogs and searched systematically, working outward from the apartment in expanding circles. Days became weeks. The initial media frenzy began to fade, though Nicole kept Layla's case in the public eye through press conferences and social media appeals. She spoke directly to whoever had taken her daughter, begging for information, for mercy, for just the chance to bring Layla home and lay her to rest with dignity. Terrence remained in jail, held without bail due to the severity of the charges and his prior record. His attorney argued that the case was circumstantial, that blood in a bedroom wasn't proof of murder, that the state couldn't even prove Layla was dead without a body. It was a legally sound argument, and it terrified Nicole to think that Terrence might eventually be released if they couldn't find Layla or build a stronger case. The prosecutors worked tirelessly, building their circumstantial case piece by piece, interviewing every person who'd interacted with Terrence in the weeks before Layla's disappearance, tracking his movements through cell phone records and surveillance footage. 3 months after Layla vanished, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A farmer named Dale Hutchins was clearing land on his property, preparing to plant a new crop. His tractor hit something that shouldn't have been there, a soft spot in the ground that gave way under the weight of the machine. Dale climbed down to investigate and saw fabric, a pink and purple pattern that looked distinctly out of place in the brown earth. His stomach turned. He'd been following Layla's case like everyone else in Riverbend, and he immediately recognized what he might have found. Dale called 911, his voice shaking as he reported the discovery. Police and forensic teams descended on the property within the hour. They carefully excavated the area, and as feared, they uncovered human remains, small and fragile, wrapped in a blanket that matched the description of the one missing from Terrence's bed. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office, where Dr. Patricia Chun conducted the examination with painstaking care. Decomposition had progressed significantly, but dental records confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains were Layla Monroe. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was asphyxiation, though the exact mechanism, whether smothering or strangulation, was difficult to determine given the state of decomposition. There was evidence of trauma that suggested sexual assault, confirmation of the horror that Nicole had feared from the moment she learned about Terrence's history. Dr. Chun documented everything with clinical precision, knowing this evidence would be crucial in court, but she went home that night and cried for hours, unable to shake the image of the small body on her examination table. Nicole was notified by victim advocates who'd been assigned to her case. They came to her apartment with a detective, their faces grave, and Nicole knew before they spoke what they were going to say. She'd been preparing herself for this possibility, trying to steel herself against it, but nothing could have prepared her for the actual moment when the words were spoken. "We found Layla. I'm so sorry, Nicole. We found her." Nicole's scream was primal, a sound of grief so raw that neighbors called the police thinking someone was being attacked. Marcus was there within minutes, and they held each other while their world collapsed, while the future they'd imagined for their daughter evaporated into nothing but memory. The recovery of Layla's body transformed the case. Murder charges were upgraded to first-degree murder with special circumstances. The district attorney announced they would seek the maximum sentence allowed under law. Terrence's attorney could no longer argue that Layla might be alive somewhere, that this was all a misunderstanding. The evidence was overwhelming. The blood, the blanket, the location matching areas where Terrence had worked, the timeline, his history, his lies. The defense shifted strategy, preparing for trial and hoping to negotiate a plea deal that might spare Terrence a life sentence without parole. But Nicole and Marcus wanted a trial. They wanted the full story told in public, wanted Terrence to be forced to sit in a courtroom and hear the evidence of what he'd done, wanted the community to understand the full scope of the tragedy. The prosecutors agreed to move forward, and the trial was set for the following spring, a full year after Layla's death. The trial, when it finally began, was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The prosecution presented their case methodically, the timeline of Layla's last hours, the physical evidence from Terrence's room and car, the testimony of the medical examiner, the statements from Daphne's son about seeing Layla follow Terrence down the hallway. Nicole testified about dropping her daughter off, about trusting that Layla would be safe, about the phone call that shattered her world. She spoke directly to the jury, her voice breaking. "I trusted that my daughter would be protected. I trusted that the people I knew would keep her safe. Terrence Cole destroyed that trust, and he took my baby from me. Nothing will bring her back, but he needs to be held accountable for every single thing he did to her." Marcus testified about the daughter he'd lost, about her curiosity and kindness, about the future that had been stolen from her. He described learning of her death while he was across the country, the agonizing flight home, the impossibility of accepting that he'd never see her again. Layla was going to do amazing things, he said, tears streaming down his face. She was smart and brave and full of life. And now all we have are memories and what-ifs. The defense presented a weak case, constrained by the overwhelming evidence. They suggested that while Terrence had been inappropriate, the death might have been accidental, that he'd panicked rather than planned. They portrayed him as a man with problems who'd made terrible mistakes but hadn't intended to kill anyone. The jury didn't buy it. After 3 weeks of testimony and only 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated sexual assault of a child. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. Nicole and Marcus both gave victim impact statements, as did Nicole's mother and several of Layla's teachers. They spoke about the hole in their lives, about the grief that consumed them, about the anger that would never fully dissipate. The judge, a woman named Sandra Pacheco who'd presided over many difficult cases in her career, seemed visibly affected. When it was her turn to speak, Judge Pacheco addressed Terrence directly. "You were a predator who exploited trust and innocence. You took a child's life in the most heinous way imaginable. The law provides for certain punishments, and I intend to impose the maximum allowed." Terrence was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus consecutive sentences for the additional charges. He would die in prison, and there was a grim satisfaction in that certainty for Nicole and Marcus. As Terrence was led out of the courtroom in shackles, he glanced back at Nicole. She met his eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. He turned away first. In the aftermath of the trial, Nicole struggled to rebuild a life that felt fundamentally broken. She attended a support group for parents who'd lost children to violence, sitting in a circle with people who understood grief in its most acute form. They shared stories, tears, and strategies for surviving the unsurvivable. Some days Nicole could function, going to work, cooking meals, maintaining the basic routines of existence. Other days she couldn't get out of bed, crushed by the weight of Layla's absence. She kept Layla's room exactly as it had been, the fantasy novel still bookmarked on the nightstand, the stuffed animals arranged on the bed, a shrine to a life cut short. Marcus threw himself into advocacy work, channeling his grief into action. He lobbied for stronger sex offender monitoring laws, for better enforcement of restrictions on contact with children, for enhanced background check requirements for anyone working or living around minors. He testified before the state legislature, his voice steady and passionate as he told Layla's story, arguing that her death could have been prevented if the systems designed to protect children had actually functioned as intended. Some of the reforms he championed were enacted, small victories that felt both meaningful and insufficient. The case attracted national attention from true crime media, documentaries, and podcasts dissecting the details of what had happened. Nicole and Marcus participated reluctantly in some of these projects, hoping that Layla's story might prevent similar tragedies. They spoke about the importance of knowing who has access to your children, about not assuming that acquaintances have been properly vetted, about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. "I didn't ask enough questions," Nicole said during one interview, her voice heavy with regret. "I didn't know Daphne's brother lived with her. I didn't know his history. I should have asked more. I should have protected her better." The interviewer, a woman who'd covered many similar cases, responded gently. "You trusted a friend. That's not a failing. Terrence Cole is responsible for what he did, not you." But Nicole couldn't fully accept that absolution. The what-ifs haunted her constantly. What if she'd called a different babysitter? What if she'd brought Layla to the dental office with her? What if she'd asked more questions about Daphne's household? The rational part of her mind knew that Terrence was solely responsible for his actions, but the grieving mother in her would always carry the burden of feeling like she should have, somehow, done more. Daphne Cole disappeared from Riverbend shortly after the trial concluded. The guilt and community judgment had become unbearable. People who'd once been her friends now avoided her, whispered about her, blamed her for not knowing what her brother was capable of, for allowing children around him despite his history. Daphne sold her possessions, took her son, and moved to another state, trying to start over somewhere nobody knew their connection to Layla's murder. She sent Nicole a letter before she left, a rambling apology that expressed remorse and anguish but could never undo the damage. Nicole read it once and then burned it, watching the paper curl and blacken, feeling nothing. The farm where Layla had been found became a place of pilgrimage for some. People leaving flowers and stuffed animals at the location where her grave had been discovered. Dale Hutchins, the farmer who'd found her, struggled with his own trauma from the discovery. He eventually sold the property, unable to work land that had held such a terrible secret. The new owners were from out of state and unaware of the history until after the purchase was finalized. When they learned what had happened there, they considered backing out of the sale, but ultimately decided to stay, believing that acknowledging the past was better than trying to erase it. They maintained a small memorial at the site, a simple stone marker that read, Layla Monroe, loved and remembered. 5 years after Layla's death, Nicole and Marcus held a memorial service on what would have been her 14th birthday. They invited family, friends, teachers, anyone whose life Layla had touched during her brief time in the world. They shared memories, looked at photos, released balloons into a cloudless sky. Nicole spoke about how she'd learned to carry her grief rather than trying to overcome it, how she'd learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, how she tried to honor Layla by living with intention and awareness. My daughter taught me so much in her 9 years, Nicole said, her voice thick with emotion. She taught me to ask questions, to be curious, to be kind. I try to live by those lessons, even though living without her is the hardest thing I've ever done. The broader lessons from Layla's case resonated beyond Riverbend. Child safety advocates used her story to push for reforms in sex offender monitoring, in background check requirements, in education about protecting children from predators. Schools implemented new policies about sleepovers and playdates, providing parents with checklists of questions to ask before allowing children to stay in others' homes. Some criticized these measures as paranoia, arguing that they fostered distrust and fear, but others saw them as necessary safeguards in a world where dangers existed in unexpected places. Terrence Cole remained in prison, housed in a facility that separated sex offenders from the general population for their own protection. He received no visitors, his family having completely severed contact with him. He filed appeals challenging various aspects of his conviction, but each was denied. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, growing old in a 6x8 cell, his name synonymous with one of the most heinous crimes in Riverbend's history. Whether he felt remorse for what he'd done remained unknown. He never gave interviews, never made public statements, never acknowledged his guilt beyond the legal verdict that had been imposed on him. For Nicole and Marcus, life moved forward in the painful way it does after devastating loss. Nicole eventually started dating again, finding companionship with a widower who understood grief's long shadow. Marcus remarried and had another child, a daughter he and his wife named Clara. Both parents felt the complicated emotions that came with these new chapters: guilt for experiencing happiness again, fear of losing more loved ones, gratitude for second chances. They maintained a relationship with each other that was built on shared history and mutual understanding, texting on Layla's birthday and the anniversary of her death, ensuring that someone else in the world was thinking about her on those difficult days. The criminal justice system had functioned in Layla's case. The guilty party had been identified, prosecuted, and sentenced. But justice, Nicole learned, was not the same as healing. Having Terrence in prison didn't bring Layla back. It didn't fill the empty chair at the dinner table or the silent bedroom down the hall. It didn't erase the nightmares or the constant wondering about Layla's final moments. Justice was necessary but insufficient, a societal response to wrongdoing that could never fully address the personal devastation left in crime's wake. The story of Layla Monroe serves as a reminder that children are vulnerable in ways that adults sometimes fail to recognize until it's too late. It highlights the importance of knowing who has access to our children, of asking difficult questions even when they feel awkward, of trusting instincts that signal danger. It also reveals the limitations of systems designed to protect children, systems that rely on compliance and monitoring but can't prevent every tragedy. Terrence Cole was supposed to stay away from minors, but rules without enforcement are just words on paper, and by the time his violation was discovered, it was already too late. In the years since Layla's death, her case has been studied in criminal justice courses, examined in child safety seminars, discussed in parenting forums. But beyond the statistics and policy debates, there remains the simple, irreducible fact of a child who should still be alive, who should be in high school now, worried about tests and friendships, and all the normal concerns of adolescence. Instead, she exists only in memory and in the hearts of those who loved her, a bright light extinguished too soon by someone who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity rather than something sacred to protect. Now the story shifts again, moving to a different coast and a different kind of betrayal. This case involves not a stranger or casual acquaintance, but someone bound by the most intimate of relationships. It takes place in Cypress Bay, a coastal community in the south where palm trees line residential streets and ocean breezes carry the scent of salt and possibility. The year is 2007, and the victim is someone who dedicated her life to healing others, someone whose murder reveals how greed and desperation can transform love into lethal calculation. Dr. Alina Reyes was a practitioner of alternative medicine, running a wellness clinic that offered acupuncture, herbal treatments, and holistic health consultations. She'd built a loyal client base over 15 years, people who trusted her gentle approach and genuine care for their well-being. Alina was 52 years old, attractive and energetic. With long dark hair she wore in a braid down her back and a perpetual tan from her daily beach walks. She practiced what she preached, maintaining a vegetarian diet, meditating every morning, and approaching life with an optimism that some found inspiring and others found slightly naive. Alina had been married to Victor Reyes for 18 years. They'd met in the late 80s at a meditation retreat, drawn together by what seemed like shared values and spiritual alignment. Victor was handsome and charming, quick with compliments and grand gestures. He worked in sales, moving between different companies and industries, always chasing the next big opportunity that never quite materialized. Where Alina was grounded and consistent, Victor was restless and acquisitive, always wanting more, better, different. They had 2 children together, a son named Daniel who was 16, and a daughter named Sophia who was 13. Both children were close to their mother, spending weekends helping at her clinic, learning about natural remedies and patient care. They admired Alina's calm presence and her ability to make people feel seen and valued. Their relationship with Victor was more complicated. He could be fun and generous when things were going well, taking them on impulsive trips to amusement parks or buying them expensive gifts they hadn't asked for. But he could also be moody and withdrawn, disappearing into his home office for hours, emerging with a tension that filled the house like static electricity. What the children didn't fully understand, what Alina herself only gradually came to recognize, was that Victor's financial situation was catastrophic. He'd made a series of increasingly desperate investments, chasing returns that would elevate his status and prove his worth. He'd day traded stocks with money they didn't have, lost substantial sums, then borrowed more to try to recover the losses. He'd invested in a friend's restaurant that failed within 6 months. He'd bought into a multi-level marketing scheme that collapsed under regulatory scrutiny. By 2007, Victor was drowning in debt, hundreds of thousands of dollars owed to credit card companies, private lenders, and people who were beginning to make threats. Alina knew some of this. She'd confronted Victor about credit card statements, about calls from collection agencies, about the way money seemed to evaporate from their accounts faster than her clinic could replenish it. Victor always had explanations, always promised he was handling it, always assured her that a big deal was about to close and everything would be fine. Alina wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the man she'd married wouldn't lie to her about something so fundamental. But doubt had been growing. and in early 2007, she'd consulted with a divorce attorney, exploring her options. The attorney had explained that in a divorce, debts incurred during the marriage were typically shared between both parties. Alina would likely be responsible for half of Victor's catastrophic financial mistakes, even though she'd opposed many of his decisions. The thought terrified her. She'd worked hard to build her clinic, to establish financial stability. The idea of being pulled down into Victor's chaos, of potentially losing her business and her home, felt unbearable. She asked the attorney about separating their finances, about protecting her assets. The attorney provided options, but they all involved significant legal fees and uncertainty. What Alina didn't know was that Victor had been taking out life insurance policies on her. It had started years earlier with a modest policy, standard financial planning for a married couple with children. But in the past 2 years, as his debt spiraled, Victor had taken out additional policies, using different insurance companies and agents, inflating Alina's income on the applications to justify higher coverage amounts. In total, he'd secured policies worth nearly $2 million, with himself as the sole beneficiary. The premiums were expensive, but Victor saw them as an investment, the only way out of the hole he'd dug. The idea likely came to him gradually, not as a single moment of decision, but as a possibility that crystallized over time. At first, maybe he told himself he was just being prudent, protecting his family's future. But as the debt mounted and creditors became more aggressive, as Alina started talking about divorce and asset protection, Victor's thinking shifted. $2 million would solve everything. It would pay off his debts, provide for the children, allow him to start fresh. And all it required was Alina's death. Victor began researching methods, using public library computers to avoid leaving a digital trail at home. He searched for information about poisons, about staged accidents, about how police investigated suspicious deaths. He learned that murders committed by strangers were often solved quickly through forensic evidence. But murders within families were more complicated, especially if there was no obvious motive and the killer seemed grief-stricken and cooperative. He learned that the first 48 hours after a death were critical, that this was when investigators were most alert to inconsistencies and deception. He also began reaching out to old acquaintances, testing who might be willing to help him for money. Victor had a cousin named Luis who lived 2 states away and had a criminal record for assault and drug offenses. Luis was broke, working odd jobs, and barely surviving. Victor called him in late March 2007, ostensibly just to catch up, but the conversation eventually turned to money troubles. "I've got some serious financial problems," Victor admitted. "I'm looking at bankruptcy, maybe losing the house. It's killing me." Luis commiserated, sharing his own struggles. Victor let silence hang for a moment, then said, "What if there was a way to solve both our problems? What if I knew how we could both get a lot of money, enough to completely turn things around?" Luis was interested but cautious. "What are you talking about? I'm not robbing a bank or anything crazy." Victor laughed, a sound without humor. "Nothing like that. Just hear me out. What if something happened to Alina, an accident or something, and I collected on her life insurance? I could pay you, say, $100,000 for helping make sure it happened the right way." The words hung in the air, shocking in their casual monstrosity. Luis should have refused immediately, should have hung up and reported the conversation. But Luis was desperate, broke, and increasingly willing to compromise his morals for money. "Are you serious right now?" he asked. Victor assured him he was completely serious. Over the next several weeks, Victor and Luis communicated through prepaid cell phones, planning in fragments of conversation that they believed couldn't be traced. They settled on a plan. Luis would recruit one more person, someone who could serve as backup and help with logistics. That person turned out to be someone Luis knew from his neighborhood, a man named Marco Diaz who worked construction and had his own financial struggles. Marco was initially reluctant, but Luis offered him $50,000, and Marco's resistance crumbled. The 3 men now formed a conspiracy bound by greed and mutual culpability. The plan was for Luis and Marco to drive to Cypress Bay on a specific night when Victor would ensure he had an alibi. They would enter the house through a back door that Victor would leave unlocked, go to the master bedroom where Alina would be sleeping, and kill her quickly and quietly. Victor insisted it had to look like a home invasion gone wrong, a burglary where Alina had surprised the intruders and been killed in the struggle. Luis and Marco would take some valuables to sell, making the burglary motive seem genuine. Then they'd drive back home, and Victor would discover his wife's body in the morning and call the police in appropriate horror. What none of them properly accounted for was how thoroughly modern technology tracks human movement. They didn't consider GPS data from their vehicles, cell phone tower pings, toll road cameras, or the digital breadcrumbs left by every electronic transaction. They operated as if it were still possible to move through the world unobserved, to commit a crime, and simply drive away into anonymity. This fundamental miscalculation would be their undoing. The night chosen for the murder was April 14th, 2007. Victor told Alina he needed to drive to a business conference in a city 3 hours away, that he'd be staying overnight at a hotel and returning the next afternoon. Alina didn't question this. Victor traveled occasionally for work, and she was actually relieved to have a quiet evening at home. Daniel was spending the night at a friend's house, and Sophia was at a sleepover birthday party. Alina would be alone, which was a rare luxury she intended to enjoy with a bath, a book, and an early night's sleep. Victor left the house around 5 in the evening, making a show of loading his overnight bag into his car and kissing Alina goodbye. He drove toward his supposed destination, but stopped at a shopping mall about an hour away. He checked into a hotel near the mall, making sure to interact with the front desk clerk to be seen and remembered. He kept his phone on, sending Alina a text at 7 saying he'd arrived safely. Then he settled in to wait, watching television with the volume low, his mind cycling through the plan's details. Meanwhile, Luis and Marco were making the long drive to Cypress Bay. They'd left early in the afternoon, stopping for gas and food at places that seemed anonymous and unremarkable. They didn't realize that every gas station and convenience store had security cameras, that every credit card transaction created a record, that their route was being documented by systems they'd never even considered. They arrived in Cypress Bay around 10 at night, parking several blocks from Alina's house in a neighborhood where their unfamiliar vehicle wouldn't immediately stand out. They walked to the house through quiet streets, both men tense and scared despite their attempts at bravado. Luis carried a knife, a large hunting blade he'd brought from home. Marco had a crowbar, ostensibly for prying open drawers and cabinets, but also serving as a potential weapon. They found the back door unlocked just as Victor had promised, the deadbolt left undone, the door opening silently when Marco turned the handle. Inside, the house was dark except for a light coming from upstairs. They could hear water running, the sound of a shower. They looked at each other, nodded, and began to move through the house, their footsteps soft on the carpeted stairs. Alina was in the master bathroom, shower steam fogging the mirror, completely unaware that 2 strangers were in her home, that her husband had orchestrated her death. What happened next unfolded in terrible violence that contradicted the plan's supposed simplicity. Alina finished her shower and stepped out, wrapping herself in a towel. She opened the bathroom door and screamed when she saw 2 men standing in her bedroom. Luis and Marco panicked, rushing at her before she could run or call for help. Alina fought with surprising strength, scratching at Marco's face, kicking Luis in the shin hard enough to make him stumble. She was shouting, screaming for help, her voice carrying into the night. Luis stabbed her, the blade entering her abdomen, then her chest. Alina gasped, her eyes wide with shock and pain, her hands trying to press against the wounds. Marco hit her with the crowbar, a blow to the head that sent her stumbling backward into the bathroom. She fell against the sink, then slid to the floor, blood pooling beneath her. The men stood frozen for a moment, horrified by what they'd done, by how different the reality of violence was from the abstract planning. They heard a neighbor's dog barking frantically, heard a voice calling out asking if everything was okay. The sound of the neighbor's voice jolted Luis and Marco into action. They rifled through the bedroom drawers, grabbing jewelry and pulling electronics from their connections with shaking hands. Marco grabbed Alina's laptop from the desk in the corner. Luis found her purse and dumped it out, taking her wallet and cell phone. They moved frantically, their careful plan abandoned in favor of raw survival instinct. Within 3 minutes they were running down the stairs, through the back door, and into the night, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their minds racing with the reality of what they'd just done. Behind them, Alina lay dying on the bathroom floor. The stab wounds had punctured vital organs, and blood loss was rapid. She was conscious for perhaps 2 minutes after the men fled, aware enough to feel her life slipping away, to understand that she'd been attacked in her own home, in the place she should have been safest. Her final thoughts remain unknowable, but it's not difficult to imagine the confusion, the fear, the desperate hope that someone would come help her. But no one did. The neighbor who'd called out received no response and assumed the scream had been from a television or some other innocuous source. Alina died alone on the cold tile floor, her blood mixing with water droplets from her interrupted shower. Luis and Marco drove away from Cypress Bay with reckless speed, their hearts pounding, adrenaline making their hands shake on the steering wheel. They didn't speak for the first hour, both processing what they'd done, both understanding that they'd crossed a line from which there was no return. Eventually Luis said, "We stick to the story. We were never there. We don't know anything about any of this." Marco nodded, though his face was ashen. He kept touching the scratches on his cheek where Alina had clawed him, evidence literally written on his skin. They stopped at a rest area and threw the knife into a dumpster, along with their blood-stained clothes. They changed into fresh clothes from a bag they'd brought, trying to clean themselves up, to remove any trace of what had happened. Then they continued driving through the night, arriving back at Luis's apartment just before dawn. They divided the stolen items, Marco taking the laptop and some jewelry, Luis keeping the rest. They agreed not to contact each other for a while, to act as if nothing had happened, to wait for Victor's payment once the insurance money came through. Victor, meanwhile, had spent a sleepless night in his hotel room. He'd expected a call or text from Luis confirming the job was done, but his phone remained silent. He told himself that was actually better, that less communication meant less evidence, but anxiety gnawed at him. He watched the news on the hotel television, flipping between channels, expecting to see breaking news about a home invasion in Cypress Bay. Nothing appeared. At 6 in the morning, he checked out of the hotel, making sure the clerk processed his payment and remembered him. Then he began the drive home, his mind cycling through possible scenarios. He arrived at the house around 9:30. The back door was still unlocked, exactly as he'd left it. He walked through the quiet house calling Alina's name, performing the role of worried husband. When she didn't answer, he went upstairs, and there he found her. The scene was horrific, blood everywhere, his wife's body crumpled on the bathroom floor, her skin pale and waxy in death. Victor forced himself to react appropriately, to scream, to collapse to his knees beside her, to pull out his cell phone with trembling hands and call 911. The dispatcher heard his panicked voice. "My wife. Oh God, my wife. She's dead. There's blood everywhere. Someone killed her. Please, you have to send someone." The dispatcher kept him on the line, asking questions, trying to gather information while simultaneously dispatching officers and paramedics to the address. Victor stayed in character, his voice breaking with sobs, answering questions about what he was seeing, about whether Alina was breathing, about whether he saw any intruders. He said he'd been away overnight, had just gotten home, had found her like this. The dispatcher instructed him to go outside and wait for police to arrive, not to touch anything else. Officers arrived within 7 minutes, securing the scene and beginning their initial investigation. Paramedics confirmed what was obvious. Alina was deceased, had been for several hours. Detectives were called in, and the house became a hive of activity. Photographers documented everything. Forensic technicians collected evidence, bagging the stolen items' empty boxes, lifting fingerprints from surfaces, gathering DNA samples from the bathroom where Alina had fought for her life. The medical examiner arrived and examined the body in situ before authorizing its transport to the morgue for autopsy. Detective Sarah Brennan was the lead investigator assigned to the case. She was a 20-year veteran of the Cypress Bay Police Department, experienced in homicide investigations and skeptical by nature. She interviewed Victor carefully, noting his responses, watching his body language. Victor told his story, the business trip, the hotel stay, the morning discovery. He showed appropriate grief, breaking down several times, his voice choked with emotion. He volunteered information about the missing laptop and jewelry, suggesting this must have been a burglary gone wrong. Detective Brennan nodded sympathetically, taking notes, asking gentle questions. But even in those first hours, details bothered her. The back door had been unlocked, but there was no sign of forced entry anywhere else. The bedroom had been ransacked, but only certain items were taken, while other valuables sat in plain sight, untouched. Alina's car keys were on the kitchen counter, her car in the driveway. If this was a random burglary, why had the intruders ignored the easy target of a vehicle? And the level of violence seemed excessive for a simple burglary interrupted. Alina had been stabbed multiple times and beaten, suggesting rage or determination rather than panic. Detective Brennan began digging into the Reyes family's background. She learned about Victor's financial troubles, about the mounting debts, about Alina's consultation with a divorce attorney. She obtained records of the life insurance policies, and her eyebrows raised when she saw the total value, $2 million, with Victor as the beneficiary. That was motive, clear and compelling. She started looking at Victor not as a grieving widower, but as a potential suspect. She assigned officers to canvass the neighborhood, interviewing everyone on the block about what they'd seen or heard that night. The neighbor who'd heard screaming was interviewed extensively. She described hearing what sounded like a woman yelling, then silence. She'd called out asking if everything was okay, but received no response. She felt guilty now for not calling the police, for assuming it was nothing serious. Detective Brennan assured her she wasn't to blame, that hindsight was always clearer than the moment itself. Forensic evidence from the scene began yielding results. The lab found DNA under Alina's fingernails where she'd scratched her attacker. They found fingerprints on the bathroom door frame that didn't match anyone in the family. They recovered a partial shoe print and blood near the bedroom door. These were significant findings, but they were useless without suspects to compare them against. Detective Brennan needed to identify who had physically committed the murder, and she believed the path to that information ran through Victor. She brought Victor in for a formal interview at the station, framing it as routine follow-up. Victor came willingly, still performing the role of cooperative victim. Detective Brennan asked him to walk through his timeline again, and this time she pressed for specifics. What time did he check into the hotel? Who did he interact with? Did he have receipts? Did he make any calls? Victor provided answers, some confident, some uncertain. Then Detective Brennan asked about his financial situation, and she watched his face carefully as his expression shifted from grief to defensiveness. "I know this is difficult," she said, her voice sympathetic, "but I have to ask about money. You had significant debts. Your wife was considering divorce, and you'd recently taken out substantial life insurance policies on her. Can you help me understand that?" Victor stumbled through an explanation about wanting to protect his family, about the policies being standard financial planning. But his voice lacked conviction, and Detective Brennan could see him calculating, trying to determine how much she knew and how much she was guessing. She didn't have enough to arrest him, not yet, but she had enough to dig deeper. She obtained warrants for phone records, bank statements, credit card transactions. She assigned officers to trace Victor's movements on the night of the murder to verify his alibi thoroughly. And she began looking into his known associates, anyone he might have enlisted to help. The break came from technology, just as it had in so many modern cases. Cell phone records showed that Victor had been in contact with Luis multiple times in the weeks before Alina's death, using a prepaid phone that he'd purchased under a fake name. But the purchase had been made with a credit card that was eventually traced back to Victor. Detective Brennan obtained warrants for Luis's phone records and discovered communications with Marco. The web was coming together. She also reviewed toll road data and discovered that a vehicle registered to Luis had passed through several toll booths on the route between his home city and Cypress Bay on the day of the murder. Security footage from those toll plazas showed Luis driving, with another person in the passenger seat who matched Marco's description. GPS data from Marco's phone, which he'd foolishly kept on during the trip, tracked the entire journey to Cypress Bay and back. Detective Brennan coordinated with law enforcement in Luis and Marco's jurisdiction, and simultaneous raids were executed in early May, less than 3 weeks after Alina's murder. Luis was arrested at his apartment at dawn, pulled from his bed by officers who found jewelry matching descriptions of items stolen from Alina's house hidden in a shoebox in his closet. Marco was taken into custody at a construction site where he was working, the scratches on his face still faintly visible, photographs taken immediately to document the evidence. Both men were read their rights and transported to holding facilities while detectives prepared for interrogation. Marco broke first. He was younger, less experienced with the criminal justice system, and terrified of spending the rest of his life in prison. When detectives showed him the evidence, the GPS data, the toll booth footage, the stolen laptop recovered from his apartment, he understood that denial was pointless. His attorney, a public defender who'd handled dozens of similar cases, advised him that cooperation might be his only chance at a reduced sentence. Marco agreed to tell the full story in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. He described the entire conspiracy: Victor's initial contact with Luis recruiting him, the planning conversations, the drive to Cypress Bay, the unlocked back door, the confrontation with Alina. He spoke in a flat, affectless voice, describing violence as if recounting a trip to the grocery store. She came out of the bathroom and saw us. She started screaming. Luis told me we had to shut her up or we'd get caught. I didn't want to hurt her, but everything happened so fast. The detectives listened, taking detailed notes, asking clarifying questions, building a timeline that could be corroborated with physical evidence. When confronted with Marco's confession, Luis's attorney also began negotiating. Luis provided additional details, including recordings of some phone conversations with Victor that he'd saved as insurance, afraid that Victor might try to avoid payment or pin everything on him. These recordings were damning. Victor's voice clearly audible, discussing the insurance money, the need to make Alina's death look like a random crime, the logistics of the attack. In one recording, Victor said, "It has to look real. Make sure there's a struggle. Take things that burglars would take. And make it quick. I don't want her to suffer more than necessary." The casual coldness of his words, the planning of his wife's murder discussed like a business transaction, made even hardened detectives feel sick. Armed with confessions and evidence, Detective Brennan obtained an arrest warrant for Victor. He was taken into custody at his home, the children present and watching in confusion and horror as their father was handcuffed and led to a police car. Daniel and Sophia were placed temporarily with Alina's sister, a woman named Carmen who lived one town over. Carmen tried to comfort them, to shield them from the worst of what was unfolding, but there was no way to protect them from the truth. Their father had arranged their mother's murder, had hired men to kill her in their family home, had done it for money. Victor maintained his innocence initially, claiming the recordings were fabricated, that Luis and Marco were lying to save themselves. But the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. Luis and Marco were charged with first-degree murder as well, though their plea agreements meant they faced life sentences rather than the death penalty. Victor faced the possibility of execution, California still having capital punishment on the books in 2007, though it was rarely carried out. The legal proceedings stretched over months. Victor's defense team, expensive attorneys paid for by liquidating every asset he had left, argued that the recordings were ambiguous, that Victor had been discussing a hypothetical scenario, that Luis and Marco were unreliable witnesses with every reason to lie. They portrayed Victor as a flawed man with financial problems, but not a murderer, suggesting that Luis and Marco had acted independently, perhaps planning to rob the house, and then implicating Victor when they were caught. The prosecution methodically dismantled these arguments. They presented the life insurance policies, the financial records showing Victor's desperate situation, the phone records establishing repeated contact between Victor and Luis in the weeks before the murder. They played the recordings, letting the jury hear Victor's voice planning his wife's death. They brought in forensic experts who matched DNA from under Alina's fingernails to Marco and fingerprints in the bedroom to Luis. They presented testimony from the medical examiner describing Alina's injuries, the fear and pain she must have experienced in her final moments. They also called Daniel and Sophia as witnesses, though both children were shielded from the most graphic details. Daniel, now 17, testified about his parents' marriage, about tensions he'd noticed, about his father's stress over money. He spoke in a trembling voice, unable to look at Victor sitting at the defense table. "I thought my dad loved my mom," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I don't understand how he could do this. I don't understand any of it." Sophia was deemed too young and traumatized to testify, but her victim impact statement was read into the record by a social worker. In it, she wrote, "My dad took my mom away forever. He took away the person who loved me most in the world. I have nightmares every night where I see her and try to tell her not to go home that night, but she can't hear me. The trial lasted 6 weeks, every day covered extensively by local media. Reporters filled the courtroom, broadcasting details to a public fascinated and repelled by the case. True crime forums dissected every piece of evidence, debated Victor's guilt or innocence despite the overwhelming proof. Alina's friends and former patients held vigils outside the courthouse, holding signs with her picture, demanding justice. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with their verdict. Victor was found guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps, though the outcome had been widely predicted. Victor showed no visible reaction, his face a mask that revealed nothing. The sentencing phase began immediately, prosecutors arguing that the murder had been especially heinous, committed for financial gain, planned and premeditated, deserving of the ultimate punishment. The defense argued for life without parole, presenting witnesses who testified about Victor's troubled childhood, his struggles with self-worth, his mental health issues that had gone untreated. They suggested that while his actions were indefensible, they didn't rise to the level requiring execution. The jury deliberated on sentencing for another day before returning with their decision: life in prison without the possibility of parole. California juries had become increasingly reluctant to impose death sentences, and this jury followed that trend, perhaps swayed by the knowledge that Victor would spend the rest of his life behind bars regardless. Luis and Marco were sentenced in separate proceedings, both receiving life sentences as part of their plea agreements. Marco's attorney argued that his client had been manipulated by Luis, that he'd been a reluctant participant driven by financial desperation. The judge was unmoved, noting that Marco had struck Alina with a crowbar, had participated actively in her murder, and that desperation didn't justify violence. Luis, the intermediary who'd recruited Marco and coordinated with Victor, received an identical sentence, the judge noting that his role in planning made him equally culpable. The insurance companies, predictably, refused to pay out on the policies. The circumstances of Alina's death, murdered by individuals her husband had hired, constituted fraud and contract violation. Victor's creditors tried to claim whatever assets remained, but there was almost nothing left. The house was sold to pay legal fees, the proceeds split among various parties with claims against Victor's estate. Daniel and Sophia inherited nothing except their mother's personal belongings and the small savings account she'd maintained separately from Victor. Carmen, their aunt, became their legal guardian. She sold her own smaller house and bought a larger one to accommodate the teenagers, trying to provide them with stability and safety. Both children struggled profoundly. Daniel developed anxiety and depression, eventually requiring hospitalization after a suicide attempt. He blamed himself irrationally, believing he should have noticed his father's planning, should have somehow prevented what happened. Therapy helped, but the guilt remained. Sophia became withdrawn and quiet, her previous warmth replaced by a wariness that broke Carmen's heart. She trusted no one, questioned everything, saw danger in ordinary situations. The community established a scholarship in Alina's name for students pursuing careers in healthcare and wellness. Her clinic was closed, the space eventually rented to a yoga studio whose owner knew nothing of the history. Alina's former patients spoke about her kindness, her dedication, the genuine care she'd shown for their well-being. She'd spent her life trying to heal people, and she'd been killed by the person who should have protected her most. The case became a study in how financial desperation can corrupt moral reasoning, how greed can transform a spouse into a murderer. Victor had looked at his wife and seen not the mother of his children, not his partner of 18 years, but a solution to his financial problems, a policy worth $2 million. The dehumanization required for such thinking was profound, a complete severing of empathy and connection. Psychologists who reviewed the case identified traits of narcissism and sociopathy in Victor's behavior, his ability to compartmentalize, to plan Alina's death while maintaining a facade of normal family life. But understanding the psychology didn't diminish the horror. It didn't comfort Daniel and Sophia as they navigated adolescence without their mother, their father's betrayal a wound that would never fully heal. It didn't restore the trust that patients had placed in Alina, the community's faith in the safety of their own homes. It didn't undo the violence of that April night when two strangers entered a house in Cypress Bay and murdered a woman in her own bathroom, while her husband waited for confirmation that the job was done. Technology had been Victor's undoing. The toll booth cameras, the GPS data, the cell phone records, all the digital traces he'd failed to consider had built an irrefutable timeline of conspiracy and murder. In an earlier era, he might have succeeded, the crime remaining unsolved, suspicion falling on random intruders who'd never be identified. But in 2007, the surveillance infrastructure had reached a level of ubiquity that made true anonymity nearly impossible. Every movement left traces, every communication a record, every transaction a breadcrumb. The case served as a grim reminder that the people closest to us, the ones who share our beds and our lives, can harbor lethal intentions. Domestic homicides account for a significant percentage of murders in the United States, and many follow patterns similar to Alina's case. Financial stress, relationship breakdown, life insurance policies taken out shortly before the death. Law enforcement agencies now train detectives to look for these patterns, to investigate spouses thoroughly even when they appear grief-stricken and cooperative, to follow the money when a violent death occurs. 10 years after Alina's murder, Daniel gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker exploring his mother's case. He was 27 by then, working as a therapist himself, specializing in trauma and grief counseling. "I think I became a therapist because I needed to understand what happened," he said, his voice steady but sad. "I needed to understand how my father could do what he did, how someone could plan the death of a person they supposedly loved. I've learned that understanding doesn't equal acceptance. I understand the psychology, the financial desperation, the narcissistic thinking, but I'll never accept it. I'll never forgive him." Daniel had not spoken to Victor since the trial. Victor had written letters from prison, attempting to explain himself, to justify his actions, to seek forgiveness from his children. Daniel burned the letters unread. Sophia, now 23, had kept her letters but never opened them, storing them in a box in her closet, unable to discard them but equally unable to face their contents. Both siblings had built lives for themselves, careers and relationships, but their mother's absence and father's betrayal remained defining facts of their existence, shaping their worldviews in ways both obvious and subtle. Carmen, who had raised them through their most difficult years, spoke about the experience with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "They're survivors," she said. "They've taken the worst thing imaginable and somehow found ways to keep living, to find purpose and meaning. But they're also permanently marked by what happened. You can see it in how careful they are with trust, how they always have backup plans, how they struggle with the idea that people are fundamentally good. Alina would have hated that her death took their innocence, but I think she'd be proud of who they've become despite it." The story now moves forward again in time and shifts to the Midwest, to a small city in the Ohio Valley called Eastmore. The year is 2016, and this case involves a different kind of victim, someone whose vulnerability was exploited by people he thought accepted him. The victim's name was Evan Cole, and his story reveals the dark side of online connections, the dangers that can hide behind friendly messages and promises of belonging, and the devastating consequences when young people searching for identity fall into the hands of predators. Evan Cole was 20 years old in the spring of 2016, a quiet young man who'd struggled to find his place in the world. He'd grown up in a conservative household in rural Pennsylvania, the youngest of 4 children, and from an early age, he'd felt different in ways he couldn't articulate. He was sensitive, artistic, more interested in poetry and music than sports or traditionally masculine pursuits. His father, a construction foreman with rigid ideas about gender and masculinity, had little patience for Evan's interests and frequently criticized him for being soft or weird. High school had been difficult. Evan was bullied for his appearance, his mannerisms, his lack of interest in the social hierarchies that governed adolescent life. He had few friends and spent most of his time alone, reading fantasy novels and writing in journals that he hid under his mattress. When he was 17, Evan began questioning his sexuality and gender identity, exploring these questions through online forums and communities where he could be anonymous and honest in ways he couldn't be at home or school. His family's reaction to his eventual coming out as queer and non-binary was painful and rejecting. His father called him confused and sick. His mother cried and begged him to pray about it. His siblings ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. Evan felt utterly alone, convinced that something was fundamentally wrong with him. that he would never find people who understood or accepted him. He withdrew further into online spaces, connecting with others who shared similar experiences of rejection and alienation. It was in one of these online communities that Evan met Mara Fields. Mara was 32, living in Eastmoor with her boyfriend, a man named Derek Vaughn who was 35. Mara presented herself as someone who understood the pain of not fitting in, who'd built a chosen family of misfits and outcasts, who offered unconditional acceptance and support. She messaged Evan frequently, asking about his day, his feelings, his dreams for the future. She told him about the house she shared with Derek, about how they often hosted young people who needed a safe place to land, who were exploring their identities away from judgmental families. To Evan, starving for acceptance and connection, Mara's attention felt like salvation. She seemed to truly see him, to value him, to offer the belonging he'd been desperately seeking. When Mara suggested that Evan consider moving to Eastmoor, staying with her and Derek for a while until he figured out his next steps, Evan was thrilled and terrified in equal measure. His rational mind whispered warnings about moving across state lines to live with people he'd never met in person, but his emotional need overwhelmed those concerns. In June 2016, Evan packed a duffel bag with his belongings, withdrew the small amount of savings he had from his bank account, and caught a bus to Eastmoor. He left a note for his parents saying he needed space to find himself, that he'd be in touch when he was ready. His mother called his phone dozens of times, leaving tearful voicemails begging him to come home. His father left a single message saying that if Evan wanted to leave, he was on his own, that the family wouldn't come looking for him. Evan, hurt by his father's coldness, but also relieved to be free of the constant judgment, turned off his phone and focused on the future he imagined awaited him. Mara picked him up at the bus station, a friendly smile on her face, immediately pulling him into a hug that felt both welcoming and slightly too familiar. She drove him to the house, a rundown two-story in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, paint peeling from the siding, the yard overgrown with weeds. Derek met them at the door, a large man with a beard and tattoos covering his arms, his expression less welcoming than Mara's, but not overtly hostile. "So you're Evan," he said, looking him up and down in a way that made Evan uncomfortable. "Mara's told me a lot about you." Inside, the house was cluttered and dim, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, the air heavy with the smell of cigarettes, and something else Evan couldn't identify. Mara showed him to a small bedroom on the second floor, a mattress on the floor, a lamp without a shade, walls painted a dingy yellow. "It's not much, but it's yours," she said, squeezing his shoulder. "Welcome home." Evan set down his duffel bag and tried to feel grateful, tried to ignore the unease creeping through his chest. The first few days were okay, even pleasant at times. Mara cooked meals, asked Evan about his interests, encouraged him to be himself without judgment. Derek was often absent, working odd jobs or disappearing for hours without explanation. When he was home, he was moody and unpredictable, friendly one moment and coldly dismissive the next. Evan tried to stay out of his way, sensing that Derek's tolerance of his presence was conditional and fragile. But patterns emerged that troubled Evan. Mara was intensely interested in his whereabouts at all times, asking where he was going if he wanted to walk to the corner store, who he was texting when he checked his phone. She discouraged him from contacting his family, saying they would only upset him, that he needed to focus on healing and moving forward. She suggested he get a job to contribute to household expenses, but when Evan found a position at a coffee shop, Mara found reasons why it wasn't a good fit, why he should keep looking for something better. Derek's behavior became more troubling. He made comments about Evan's appearance, his body, his clothing choices, observations that felt invasive and inappropriate. He accidentally walked in on Evan changing clothes multiple times. He insisted on hugs that lasted too long, his hands moving to places that made Evan freeze with discomfort. Evan tried to set boundaries, saying he preferred personal space, but Derek would laugh and accuse him of being uptight, saying that this was a household where people were affectionate and open, that Evan needed to relax. Evan wanted to leave, but he had nowhere to go. His savings were nearly depleted, spent on bus tickets and the rent Mara had started demanding. His family had made it clear they wouldn't welcome him back. He felt trapped, the promised sanctuary revealed as something much darker, but escape seemed impossible. He started spending more time in his room, avoiding common areas, trying to become invisible. Mara noticed his withdrawal and confronted him about it, her tone shifting from nurturing to accusatory. "After everything we've done for you, you're going to be ungrateful? You're going to sulk and act like you're too good for us?" The situation escalated in late July. Evan had managed to save a small amount of money from doing yard work for neighbors and was planning to leave, to catch a bus somewhere, anywhere else. He'd contacted a youth shelter in a nearby city, explaining his situation, and they'd agreed to hold a bed for him. He planned to leave the next morning, early, before Mara and Derek woke up. But that night, Derek discovered Evan's plan. He'd gone through Evan's phone while Evan was showering, reading messages, seeing the shelter contact information. Derek was waiting in Evan's room when Evan returned, his face flushed with anger. "You're planning to leave?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "After everything? You're just going to sneak out like a coward." Evan, wearing only a towel, backed toward the door, fear flooding his system. "I just think it's better if I go. This isn't working out. I'm grateful for the help, but I need to move on." Derek stood, blocking the doorway, his size suddenly menacing. "You're not going anywhere. You owe us. You think housing and food are free? You think you can just use people and leave?" Mara appeared behind Derek, her expression cold in a way Evan had never seen before. "Derek's right. You've taken advantage of our generosity. You need to make this right before you go anywhere." Evan's mind raced, trying to understand what they wanted, what making it right meant. He offered to pay them back over time, to send money once he got a job, but Mara shook her head. "It's not about money. It's about respect, about loyalty, about understanding that actions have consequences." What happened next was never fully clear, the details lost to trauma, and the fact that Evan would never be able to tell his own story. The confrontation escalated, voices rising, and at some point Derek grabbed Evan, his hands around Evan's throat, squeezing. Whether it was meant as intimidation or if Derek intended to kill him from the start remained a point of legal debate. But the pressure increased, Evan unable to breathe, his hands clawing at Derek's arms, his vision darkening. Mara watched, doing nothing to stop it, her face expressionless. Evan died there in that shabby bedroom, strangled by someone he'd trusted to provide safety, while another person who'd promised acceptance stood by and watched. His body went limp, his eyes going vacant, his 20 years of life extinguished by violence born of rage and a desire for control. Derek released him, and Evan's body crumpled to the floor. The two killers stood over him in the sudden silence, the magnitude of what they'd done settling over them like toxic fog. They panicked. Derek paced the room, running his hands through his hair, muttering about what they'd do, how they'd handle this. Mara, always the planner, suggested they had to get rid of the body, that no one knew Evan was there, that he'd told his family he was leaving and they wouldn't be looking for him. It was a calculation born of desperation and sociopathy, a decision to compound murder with desecration. Over the next several hours, in that upstairs bedroom, they dismembered Evan's body. The details are too graphic to recount fully, but they used tools from Derek's work, a saw and knives, and they worked methodically to reduce Evan to pieces that could be separately disposed of. They put the remains in trash bags, cleaning the room as best they could, trying to eliminate evidence of what had occurred. Then they waited for darkness, loading the bags into Derek's truck, and drove to various locations across the city, disposing of pieces in dumpsters, a river, a construction site, scattered so widely that finding them all would be nearly impossible. They returned home near dawn, exhausted and bloodstained despite their attempts to stay clean. They showered separately, burned their clothes in the backyard in a metal drum, and tried to scrub the bedroom of any traces of blood. Then they tried to resume normal life, going to work, eating meals, interacting with neighbors as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just committed murder and spent hours dismembering a young person who'd come to them seeking acceptance. But the digital trail they'd created was extensive and damning. Evan's communications with Mara were all documented in email accounts and messaging apps that preserved every conversation. His bus ticket to Eastmoor was a matter of record. His last known location, before his phone went silent, pinged off cell towers in Eastmoor's vicinity. And perhaps most significantly, Evan had mentioned to the youth shelter worker where he was staying, providing Mara's address as his current location. When Evan stopped responding to messages from the shelter, the worker became concerned and reached out to Eastmoor police for a welfare check. An officer visited the house in early August, knocking on the door, asking Mara and Derek if they knew Evan Cole. Mara smiled and said yes. Evan had stayed with them briefly but had left about a week ago, said he was heading to California to stay with friends. The officer made notes, thanked them, and left. It seemed routine, another young person moving around, not unusual or alarming. But the shelter worker wasn't satisfied and contacted Evan's family, asking if they'd heard from him. His mother, frantic with worry that she'd tried to suppress, immediately reported him as a missing person. Pennsylvania police coordinated with Eastmoor authorities, and a more thorough investigation began. Detectives interviewed Mara and Derek again, this time at the police station, asking detailed questions about Evan's time in their home, about when exactly he'd left, about where he'd said he was going. The stories didn't hold up under scrutiny. Mara said Evan had left on a Tuesday, Derek said Wednesday. Mara said he'd taken a bus, Derek said a friend had picked him up. The inconsistencies were red flags, and detectives pressed harder. They obtained warrants to search the house and Derek's truck, and forensic teams descended on the property. What they found was damning despite the cleanup efforts. Luminol revealed blood spatter in the upstairs bedroom, patterns consistent with violence. They found trace amounts of blood in the truck bed, in the cracks of the truck's floor. They found bleach-soaked towels in the garage, hair and tissue samples that would later be matched to Evan through DNA analysis. Confronted with this evidence, Mara broke. She blamed everything on Derek, claiming she'd been terrified of him, that he'd killed Evan in a rage and forced her to help dispose of the body. She agreed to cooperate, to show investigators where they disposed of remains, in exchange for a reduced sentence. Over several days, she led police to 7 different locations across Eastmoor, and at each one, they found what she described. The recovery was grim work, technicians collecting remains from dumpsters and waterways, piecing together enough to confirm through DNA that they belonged to Evan Cole. Derek, facing overwhelming evidence and his partner's betrayal, admitted to killing Evan but claimed it was an accident, that he'd only meant to scare him, that things had gotten out of hand. He maintained that Mara had been an equal participant in everything that followed, that she'd suggested dismemberment and disposal, that she'd worked alongside him without hesitation. The conflicting narratives would be sorted out in court, but both were clearly guilty of murder and abuse of a corpse at minimum. The investigation uncovered disturbing patterns in Mara and Derek's history. They'd hosted other young people over the years, vulnerable individuals seeking community and acceptance. Most had left after short stays, uncomfortable with the atmosphere, but unharmed. But investigators found evidence suggesting Evan might not have been their first victim. There were reports from former residents of controlling behavior, of inappropriate advances, of situations that had nearly turned violent. One young woman described being locked in her room for 2 days after trying to leave, eventually escaping through a window. She'd never reported it, too afraid and ashamed, but now she came forward, adding to the picture of predators who'd specifically targeted vulnerable youth. Evan's parents learned of their son's death through a phone call from detectives, the worst conversation any parent can receive. His mother collapsed, his father, his earlier harshness toward Evan now a source of crushing guilt, locked himself in his garage for hours, emerging with red eyes and shaking hands. They'd lost their son twice. First when he'd left seeking acceptance they couldn't provide, then permanently to violence he'd encountered while searching for it. The trial drew significant media attention, particularly from LGBTQ advocacy groups who pointed to Evan's case as an example of how vulnerable queer youth could be exploited by predators posing as allies. Evan had been searching for acceptance, for community, for people who would see him as he was and value him. Instead, he'd found people who recognized his vulnerability and used it against him, who offered sanctuary as a trap, who killed him when he tried to escape. The prosecution presented the case as premeditated murder, arguing that Derek had killed Evan deliberately to maintain control, that Mara had been a willing participant who'd enabled the violence and then helped cover it up. They presented the digital communications showing how Mara had groomed Evan online, isolating him from his support systems, making him dependent on her and Derek. They showed the progression of controlling behaviors, the financial exploitation, the sexual harassment. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about predatory patterns, about how abusers identify and target vulnerable individuals. The defense attorneys, working separately for each defendant since their interests had diverged, tried different strategies. Derek's lawyer argued for manslaughter rather than murder, claiming the death had occurred during a heated argument without premeditation, that Derek's actions afterward were panic responses rather than calculated cover-up. Mara's attorney portrayed her as a victim herself, controlled and manipulated by Derek, too frightened to stop him or to report what had happened, her cooperation with disposal done under duress. The jury didn't buy either narrative. The evidence of planning, of targeting Evan specifically, of the coordinated disposal across multiple locations, all pointed to calculated action rather than panicked reaction. After 2 weeks of testimony and 5 hours of deliberation, both defendants were found guilty of first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and additional charges related to their treatment of Evan before his death. Derek was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge, a man named Raymond Torres who'd seen countless terrible cases in his 30 years on the bench, spoke directly to Derek at sentencing. You identified a vulnerable young person who was searching for acceptance and safety. You lured him into your home under false pretenses. You exploited him financially and emotionally. And when he tried to exercise his autonomy and leave, you killed him and desecrated his body. You are a predator of the worst kind, and society requires permanent separation from people like you. Mara received a sentence of 40 years to life, the reduced sentence reflecting her cooperation with investigators and the recovery of Evan's remains. But the judge made clear that her role had been essential to the crime. You were the welcoming face, the one who made Evan feel safe enough to come to Eastmoor. You groomed him online, isolated him from his support systems, and facilitated his exploitation. When Derek killed him, you didn't try to stop it, didn't call for help, didn't report it afterward. Instead, you helped hide the crime. Your cooperation with investigators doesn't erase your culpability for everything that preceded it. 3 days after sentencing, Derek was found dead in his cell. He'd fashioned a noose from a bedsheet and hanged himself, unable or unwilling to face decades of imprisonment. Some saw it as cowardice, others as a form of justice, taking the punishment into his own hands. Evan's mother said simply, "I'm glad he's dead. I hope he suffered. I hope he felt even a fraction of the fear Evan must have felt." Evan's parents established a foundation in his memory, focused on supporting LGBTQ youth who were estranged from their families or experiencing homelessness. They worked to create safe housing options, properly vetted and supervised, where young people could land without falling prey to predators. It was their attempt to make meaning from tragedy, to ensure that other families wouldn't experience what they had. Evan's father spoke publicly about his regrets, about how his inability to accept his son had pushed Evan away, had made him vulnerable to exploitation. "I was so worried about what other people would think, about my own discomfort with things I didn't understand, that I failed to protect my child," he said at a fundraising event, his voice breaking. "I can't undo that, but I can try to help other kids like Evan find safety and acceptance, so they don't have to risk everything just to be themselves." The case highlighted systemic failures in protecting vulnerable populations. Evan's move across state lines to stay with adults he'd met online should have triggered more scrutiny, more safeguards. But there were no mechanisms in place to monitor such situations. His family's rejection had created a vacuum that predators had filled. The online spaces where Mara had initially contacted him had no meaningful protections against adults grooming young people for exploitation. Each gap in the system had contributed to creating the conditions for tragedy. Digital forensics had solved the case, just as technology had been crucial in solving the previous cases. The emails, the messaging apps, the cell phone location data, the search histories on Mara and Derek's computers showing research into body disposal. All of it combined to create an irrefutable record of what had happened. In the same way that technology had enabled Mara to access and groom Evan, it had also documented the crime and led to accountability. For LGBTQ advocates, Evan's case became a rallying point for discussions about protecting vulnerable youth, about the dangers of family rejection, about the predators who specifically target queer and trans young people. They organized campaigns to educate parents about the consequences of rejection, to provide resources for families struggling with acceptance, to create networks of support that could catch young people before they fell into dangerous situations. Evan's story was told and retold, a cautionary tale and a call to action, a reminder that acceptance and belonging are fundamental human needs, and that the absence of legitimate sources for those needs can drive people toward dangerous substitutes. Now the final case, the fifth story in this collection, brings us to a cold case that stretched across 2 decades before resolution. This one takes place in Pine Ridge County, a rural area where farm fields stretch to the horizon and neighbors know each other's business, or think they do. The disappearance occurred in 2003, but the truth wouldn't emerge until 2024, a testament to perseverance, advancing technology, and sometimes the unexpected ways that justice finds its path. Miguel Alvarez was 34 years old when he vanished in October 2003. He worked as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop, known for his skill with engines and his friendly demeanor. He lived with his wife, Linda, and their 7-year-old daughter, Rosa, in a small house on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids rode bikes unsupervised. Miguel was well-liked, the kind of person who'd help neighbors with car troubles without expecting payment, who coached youth soccer on weekends, who seemed content with his quiet life. But beneath the surface, Miguel and Linda's marriage was deteriorating. They'd married young, barely out of their teens, and the years had revealed fundamental incompatibilities. Miguel wanted more children, Linda didn't. Miguel was satisfied with their modest lifestyle. Linda resented the limitations of small-town life and their tight finances. Arguments became frequent, mostly behind closed doors, but occasionally spilling into public spaces. Raised voices in the grocery store parking lot or tense silences at church gatherings that made people uncomfortable. In early October 2003, Linda told family and friends that Miguel had left her, that he'd decided the marriage was over and was moving to another state to start fresh. She seemed upset, but not devastated, more resigned than heartbroken. She told Rosa that her father had gone away for work and might not be coming back for a long time. Rosa cried and asked when she could talk to him, but Linda said he wasn't ready for contact, that he needed space. It seemed sad, but not entirely surprising to those who knew the couple, another marriage failing, another family fractured. Miguel's family, however, was immediately suspicious. Miguel was close with his parents and siblings, talking to them multiple times a week. It was completely out of character for him to leave without explanation, without even a phone call to say goodbye. His mother, Carmen, called Linda repeatedly asking for details about where Miguel had gone, how to reach him, when he might visit. Linda's answers were vague and inconsistent, saying Miguel was somewhere in California or maybe Nevada, that he'd call when he was ready, that Carmen needed to respect his decision to start over. Carmen reported Miguel as a missing person to the Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Department. A deputy took the report, but seemed skeptical that there was anything to investigate. Linda had a reasonable explanation for Miguel's absence. There was no evidence of foul play, and adults had the right to leave if they chose. The deputy made some perfunctory inquiries, confirmed that Miguel hadn't shown up for work at the auto shop, noted that there'd been no activity on his bank account or credit cards, but concluded that Miguel had probably left as Linda claimed, perhaps using cash and staying under the radar to avoid being found. Months passed with no word from Miguel. Carmen refused to accept that her son had simply vanished without contacting anyone in his family. She knew Miguel, knew his character, knew that even if he'd left his marriage, he would have told her, would have maintained contact with his daughter, would have given some explanation for his departure. She hired a private investigator with money she couldn't really afford to spend, a retired detective named Harold Moss who agreed to look into Miguel's disappearance. Harold conducted interviews with Miguel's friends, co-workers, and family members. Everyone described Miguel as responsible and family-oriented, not the type to abandon his daughter without explanation. Harold interviewed Linda multiple times, finding her responses evasive and defensive. When pressed about specific details, where exactly Miguel had gone, whether she'd received any communication from him, how he'd transported himself since his car remained at the house, Linda became angry and accused Harold of harassment. She said Miguel had left with a friend, that she didn't know which friend, that she wasn't going to answer any more questions without a lawyer present. Harold's investigation hit dead ends. There was no paper trail of Miguel leaving Pine Ridge County, no bus tickets purchased, no car rentals, no credit card activity. His personal belongings remained at the house, his clothes still in the closet, his tools still in the garage. Harold found this suspicious, but couldn't prove anything criminal had occurred. He provided his findings to Carmen, expressing his belief that something was wrong, but without a body or concrete evidence of a crime, there was nothing law enforcement could do. The case went cold. Carmen continued to hope her son would return, would call, would somehow emerge from wherever he'd gone. But as years passed, hope transformed into a different kind of certainty. The certainty that Miguel was dead, that something terrible had happened, that Linda knew more than she was saying. Carmen couldn't prove it, couldn't make anyone listen, but she knew in her bones that her son hadn't left voluntarily. Linda moved on with her life. She remarried in 2006 to a man named Robert Chun who worked in pharmaceutical sales. They moved to another state, taking Rosa with them, further distancing themselves from Miguel's family and the questions that wouldn't stop. Carmen tried to maintain contact with her granddaughter, but Linda made it increasingly difficult, screening calls, denying visitation requests, eventually cutting off contact entirely. Rosa grew up knowing her father had left when she was 7, never understanding the full complexity of what had actually happened. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source 21 years later. In 2024, a group of high school students in Pine Ridge County were working on a documentary project about local cold cases as part of their journalism class. They'd chosen Miguel Alvarez's disappearance as their subject, interviewing Carmen and other family members, reviewing old police reports, trying to piece together what had happened. The students, equipped with modern research tools and fresh perspectives, began combing through local news archives and public records. One student, a young woman named Sarah Chun, ironically sharing a surname with Linda's second husband though unrelated, discovered something that previous investigators had missed. In November 2003, just weeks after Miguel's disappearance, there had been a fire on a property owned by Linda's brother, Thomas Garrett. The fire had destroyed an old storage container on the rural property, the kind of container used for storing farm equipment. The fire department had responded, determined the fire was likely caused by discarded cigarettes or debris combustion, and filed a routine report. It hadn't seemed connected to anything, just one of those minor incidents that occur regularly in rural areas. But Sarah wondered why Linda's brother's property would have a fire just weeks after Miguel disappeared. She drove out to the location, now abandoned and overgrown, and found the remains of the burnt storage container still sitting where it had been 2 decades earlier, rusted and partially collapsed. She took photos and brought them to her teacher, who agreed they should contact the sheriff's department with their findings. The current sheriff, a woman named Andrea Collins who'd taken office 10 years after Miguel's disappearance, reviewed the students' research with interest. She'd inherited the cold case files and had always felt that Miguel Alvarez's disappearance warranted more investigation than it had received. She organized a search of Thomas Garrett's property, bringing in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar to search the area around where the storage container had been. The dogs alerted on a specific location near the container's original placement. Excavation revealed what appeared to be bone fragments and other human remains, buried shallowly in soil that showed evidence of having been disturbed and then covered. The remains were carefully collected and sent to the state forensic laboratory for analysis. DNA testing, far more advanced in 2024 than it had been in 2003, confirmed what Carmen had known for 2 decades. The remains were Miguel Alvarez. The medical examiner determined that Miguel had died from blunt force trauma to the head, the skull showing evidence of multiple impacts consistent with being struck with a heavy object. The remains had been burned, likely in the storage container fire, in an attempt to destroy evidence. But fire doesn't consume everything, and enough had remained for identification and determination of cause of death. This was clearly homicide, not an accident or natural death. Sheriff Collins immediately reopened the investigation as a murder case. She brought Linda in for questioning, along with Thomas Garrett. Both had aged in the intervening decades, Linda now 57, Thomas 62, but the weight of old secrets showed in their faces the moment Sheriff Collins mentioned the remains that had been found. Linda initially denied any knowledge, maintaining her story that Miguel had left voluntarily. But when confronted with the fact that his remains had been found on her brother's property, buried and burned, her composure cracked. Her attorney, hastily retained when she'd been called in for questioning, advised her to say nothing further. Thomas Garrett also refused to answer questions without legal counsel present. But investigators had tools that hadn't existed in 2003. They obtained warrants for phone records from 2003, stored in archives by telecommunications companies, showing multiple calls between Linda and Thomas in the days before and after Miguel's disappearance. They found financial records showing that Linda had withdrawn a large sum from a joint account she'd shared with Miguel the day before he vanished, money that had never been accounted for. They interviewed Rosa, now 31 years old and living across the country, who agreed to speak with investigators. Rosa's testimony was heartbreaking. She'd been 7 when her father disappeared, but she remembered the night before better than Linda probably realized. She remembered hearing her parents arguing violently, heard crashing sounds, and her mother screaming. She remembered hiding in her room, frightened, pulling her blanket over her head. She remembered that in the morning, her father wasn't there, and her mother had a bruise on her face and scratches on her arms that she said came from falling in the garden. She remembered her Uncle Thomas arriving that morning, his truck backed up to the garage, the 2 adults loading something heavy wrapped in plastic into the truck bed. She remembered asking where her father was and being told sharply to go inside, to stay in her room, to not ask questions. For years, Rosa had suppressed these memories, convinced herself they couldn't mean what they seemed to mean. But now, faced with evidence of her father's murder, the memories flooded back with terrible clarity. Armed with this testimony and the physical evidence, prosecutors charged Linda Alvarez Chun with first-degree murder. Thomas Garrett was charged as an accessory after the fact for helping dispose of the body and destroy evidence. Both were arrested and held without bail, flight risks given the severity of the charges and the fact that Linda had already moved across state lines years earlier. The trial began in early 2025, more than 2 decades after Miguel's death. The prosecution presented their case methodically. The deteriorating marriage, the financial motive of life insurance, and sole ownership of marital assets, the phone records showing coordination with Thomas, the physical evidence of Miguel's remains, and Rosa's testimony about what she'd witnessed as a child. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that remains found 20 years after death couldn't definitively prove how Miguel had died or who was responsible, that Rosa's childhood memories were unreliable and potentially influenced by suggestion. They suggested that Thomas could have been solely responsible, that perhaps he'd killed Miguel for reasons unrelated to Linda, and she'd only learned about it after the fact. But the jury found the totality of evidence convincing. The arguments the night before Miguel's disappearance, Linda's immediate possession of all marital assets, her false statements about Miguel's whereabouts, the coordination with her brother, the disposal of the body on Thomas's property, all of it pointed to a coordinated murder and cover-up. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts for both defendants. Linda was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge, a veteran of the bench named Marcus Whitfield, spoke directly to Linda before pronouncing sentence. "You murdered your husband, the father of your child, and then spent 21 years lying about it. You denied his family the chance to mourn him properly. You denied your daughter the truth about her father. You built a new life on top of his grave, literally and figuratively, and showed no remorse until you were caught. The law allows me only one appropriate sentence for such calculated cruelty." Thomas Garrett received 15 years for his role in disposing of Miguel's body and destroying evidence. His attorney had argued that Thomas had been manipulated by his sister, that he'd made a terrible decision to help family but hadn't participated in the actual killing. The judge was somewhat sympathetic to this argument, but noted that Thomas's actions had prevented justice for 2 decades, had allowed Linda to evade accountability, and Miguel's family to suffer without answers. Carmen Alvarez attended every day of the trial, now in her 80s, her hair white and her body frail, but her eyes sharp and determined. When the guilty verdicts were read, she wept, not from joy but from relief and vindication. After the sentencing, she spoke to reporters gathered outside the courthouse. "I never stopped believing that my son deserved justice. I knew Linda had done something to him. I knew he would never have abandoned Rosa or his family. It took 21 years, but the truth finally came out. I can rest now, knowing Miguel can rest too. Rosa provided a victim impact statement that she read through tears, her voice shaking but resolute. My mother took my father from me when I was 7 years old. She lied to me my entire life about what happened to him. She let me grow up thinking he'd abandoned us, that he hadn't loved me enough to stay. I spent years in therapy trying to understand why I wasn't good enough for my own father to want me. Now I know the truth. He never left. He never stopped loving me. He was murdered by the person who should have protected our family, and she let me carry that pain for decades while she built a new life. I don't know if I'll ever forgive her. I don't know if I'm supposed to. The case drew attention from true crime media, another story of domestic violence and murder, of family betrayal and long-delayed justice. The high school students whose documentary project had led to the breakthrough were interviewed extensively, their journalism teacher receiving awards for innovative curriculum that had real-world impact. Sarah Chun, the student who'd connected the fire to Miguel's disappearance, went on to study forensic science in college, inspired by the case to pursue a career in criminal investigation. The property where Miguel's remains had been found was sold by the county after Thomas Garrett's conviction resulted in asset forfeiture. The new owners, aware of the history, cleared the land completely and planted a memorial garden, a peaceful space with benches and native plants, dedicated to Miguel's memory and to all victims of domestic violence who die in silence. Carmen lived to see justice for her son, but passed away 2 years after the trial, at peace finally after decades of not knowing. Her funeral was attended by Miguel's siblings, his friends, his former co-workers, and Rosa, who'd reconnected with her father's side of the family and found comfort in their shared memories of a man she'd barely known, but who had loved her deeply. Carmen was buried next to Miguel, their plots marked with stones that read, "Mother and Son, reunited in truth." The story of Miguel Alvarez serves as a reminder that some cases are never truly cold, that advances in technology and renewed attention can breathe life into investigations that seemed hopeless. It demonstrates the importance of families who refuse to stop asking questions, who trust their instincts when official conclusions don't align with what they know about their loved ones. And it reveals how patience, perseverance, and sometimes luck or unexpected connections can bring resolution even after decades of uncertainty. These 5 cases, spanning nearly 2 decades and scattered across the country, share common threads despite their differences. They reveal how violence often comes from within our circles of trust, from spouses, family members, acquaintances who exploit the vulnerability that proximity creates. They demonstrate how financial desperation, rage, entitlement, and predatory instincts can transform ordinary people into killers, how the line between control and murder can be crossed in moments or carefully planned over weeks. They also show how technology has revolutionized criminal investigation, how digital footprints and surveillance infrastructure create records that perpetrators rarely consider, how DNA analysis and forensic advances can solve cases that would have remained mysteries in earlier eras. GPS data, cell phone records, security cameras, email archives, all of these tools have made it increasingly difficult to commit murder and escape accountability, though people continue to try, often with a naivety about their own traceability that proves their undoing. But beyond the investigative techniques and legal outcomes, these stories are fundamentally about human beings whose lives were cut short by violence, about families left behind to navigate grief and seek justice, about communities forced to confront the reality that danger can hide behind familiar faces. Daniel Crossley's victims at that Christmas Eve gathering, Layla Monroe searching for her mother after a sleepover, Alina Reyes trusting her husband while he planned her death, Evan Cole seeking acceptance from predators, Miguel Alvarez arguing with his wife the night before he'd be killed. All of them were people with futures that were stolen, with potential that will never be realized, with loved ones who carry the burden of their absence every day. The cases also highlight systemic failures and gaps in protection. Sex offender monitoring that doesn't prevent contact with children. Life insurance policies that create financial incentives for murder. Online spaces where predators can groom vulnerable youth without detection. Cold case investigations that lack resources or attention until years have passed. Each tragedy points to places where intervention might have been possible, where different choices or better safeguards might have prevented violence. For survivors and family members, justice provides some measure of closure but can never restore what was lost. Marina Delgado and her family will always carry the trauma of that Christmas Eve attack. Nicole and Marcus Monroe will never watch their daughter grow up, graduate, have her own family. Daniel and Sofia Reyes lost both parents, one to murder and one to prison. The youth shelter worker who tried to help Evan Cole will always wonder if she could have done more. Rosa Alvarez lived 3 decades without knowing her father hadn't abandoned her, and now must process that truth alongside the horror of how he died. These are the real costs of violence, the ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate victim, touching everyone connected to them, reshaping communities, changing how people perceive safety and trust. The perpetrators in these cases, whether dead like Daniel Crossley and Derek Vaughn, or in prison like Terrence Cole, Victor Reyes, Mara Fields, and Linda Alvarez Chun, created devastation that will echo for generations. If these stories carry lessons, they are these. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Ask difficult questions even when they're uncomfortable. Know who has access to your children and your vulnerable family members. Recognize that financial desperation and relationship breakdown are high-risk situations for violence. Understand that the people closest to us can harbor intentions we never suspected. And perhaps most importantly, remember that victims of violence are human beings with stories, not just names in news reports, and their families deserve both justice and compassion as they navigate the aftermath of unthinkable loss. The 5 cases presented here represent a tiny fraction of the violence that occurs daily, the murders investigated and prosecuted, the lives ended and families shattered. But in their specificity, in the details of how these particular crimes unfolded and were ultimately resolved, they offer insights into human nature at its darkest and into the ways that society attempts to respond to violence, to hold perpetrators accountable, and to support those left behind. As you process these stories, whether to help you drift into sleep or simply to understand the darker corners of human behavior, remember the victims whose names have been spoken here. Remember that behind every true crime story are real people whose futures were stolen, real families whose lives were irrevocably altered, real communities that had to grapple with the reality that violence had touched their seemingly safe spaces. Thank you for listening to these accounts, for bearing witness to these tragedies, and for allowing their stories to be told. If you found value in this video, please take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments about which case affected you most, or share your own insights about these tragic events. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Your engagement helps this content reach others who are interested in understanding the complexities of criminal behavior and the pursuit of justice. Most importantly, if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, feeling unsafe in a relationship, or struggling with thoughts of harming yourself or others, please reach out for help. Resources exist, hotlines operate 24 hours a day, counselors are available to listen without judgment. Violence is never the answer, and help is always available for those willing to reach for it. These stories end here, but the lives they touched continue. The survivors keep surviving, the investigators keep investigating, the families keep remembering. And in that remembering, in the refusal to let these victims be forgotten, there is a form of justice that exists alongside the legal verdicts, a recognition that these lives mattered, that their loss diminished us all, and that bearing witness to their stories is itself an act of honoring their memory. Sleep well, knowing that even in the darkest stories, there are people working toward justice, families refusing to give up, communities coming together to support the wounded. The world contains both tremendous cruelty and tremendous resilience, and it is in that tension that we find our way forward, one case at a time, one day at a time, one story at a time.